My husband told his friends, "I doubt this joke of a marriage will survive another year. She's nowhere near my level." They laughed, proud of him. I smiled and said, "Why wait a year? Let's end it today." Then I walked out. That night, his best friend sent a message that made my breath catch. "I doubt this joke of a marriage will survive another year. She's nowhere near my level anymore." Dominic's voice carried clearly through the French doors to the patio where I stood frozen with the tray of steaks I'd been bringing out for his Thursday night gathering. Through the glass, I could see Nathan, Trevor, and Marcus raising their glasses in approval, their laughter sharp and congratulatory. They were sitting around my outdoor furniture, drinking wine from my collection, eating food I'd prepared, in the backyard of the house I'd paid for, toasting my husband's declaration that I was beneath him. Nathan actually stood up to pat Dominic on the back, saying something about how he deserved better. I set the tray down on the patio table with steady hands, though every cell in my body was screaming. They hadn't seen me yet. For 30 seconds I stood there watching my husband accept praise for planning to leave me, watching him glow with pride as his friends validated his contempt for the woman who'd built everything around them. Before we go further, thank you for being here and diving into Ruby's journey. If you believe no one should be diminished for their success, hit subscribe. It's free and helps empower more voices like hers. Now let's continue. The steak sat on the tray, still sizzling from the grill, while I remained motionless behind the pillar. Through the glass doors, Trevor was refilling everyone's glasses with the Chateau Margaux I'd been saving for our anniversary next month. Marcus had his feet up on the ottoman I'd special ordered from Italy when we'd renovated the patio last spring. They looked so comfortable in the space I'd created, so at home in the success I'd built, while they celebrated my husband's decision to leave me. "How long have you been feeling this way?" Nathan asked, leaning forward with the kind of interest men show when they're about to hear gossip they can use later. "Months," Dominic replied, swirling his wine with the practiced motion of someone who'd learned about wine from YouTube videos rather than actual knowledge. "Ever since Ruby landed the Morrison Industries account. She acts like she single-handedly saved the company. The ego on her lately is unbearable." The Morrison Industries account. The one I'd pitched alone while Dominic was at a golf tournament in Palm Springs. The one that had taken 17 meetings, 3 redesigned proposals, and a complete restructuring of our service offerings to land. The account that currently generated 40% of our revenue and had led to 3 other Fortune 500 companies signing with us. "You built that company from nothing," Marcus said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd never seen a single financial report. "She just got lucky with a few good quarters." I watched Dominic nod, accepting this revision of history as if it were fact. As if he hadn't been unemployed when we met. As if I hadn't been running a successful freelance operation that I'd transformed into an agency while he pursued one failed venture after another. The crypto trading platform that lost $60,000. The meal kit subscription service that never launched. The meditation app that couldn't compete with free alternatives. Each failure had eaten into our savings, the savings I'd built, while he promised the next idea would be the one. Trevor stood up to grab another bottle from the wine fridge I'd installed in the outdoor kitchen. "You need someone who appreciates what you bring to the table, Dom. Someone who understands that being a visionary isn't about the day-to-day grunt work. Being a visionary. That's what Dominic called himself at dinner parties while I handled the actual vision of growing our company. He'd corner people with his theories about disrupting industries while I was closing deals, managing staff and answering client calls at midnight. He'd pontificate about leadership philosophy while I led, about strategy while I strategized, about success while I succeeded. "Ruby's changed," Dominic continued, his voice taking on the wounded tone of someone who'd practiced this speech. "She used to support my dreams. Now she just throws numbers in my face. Revenue this, profit margins that. She doesn't understand that business is about more than spreadsheets." Nathan laughed, the sound echoing across the patio I'd designed with the landscape architect. "Sounds like she's become one of those typical corporate drones. No vision, just execution. Just execution. The execution that had taken us from a home office to a downtown suite with 23 employees. The execution that meant Dominic could drive his BMW, wear his designer suits, play golf at the country club, and host these Thursday night gatherings where he apparently discussed how far beneath him I'd fallen. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Sarah, our senior developer. "Morrison Industries loves the new campaign proposal. They're ready to sign the expansion contract tomorrow. You did it again. Tomorrow. I had the biggest meeting of our company's history tomorrow. A contract that would double our revenue and establish us as a major player in the industry. And here was my husband, my business partner, the man whose name sat beside mine on every company document, telling his friends our marriage was a joke. The thing is, Dominic said, pouring himself another glass, his fourth by my count, I've been documenting everything. Every time she makes a decision without consulting me, every time she undermines my authority with the staff. My lawyer says I have a strong case for taking at least half the company, maybe more. His lawyer. Derek Paulson from the country club, the one he told me was just a racquetball partner. They'd been meeting about dividing assets I'd built while I was building them. Smart man, Trevor said, raising his glass again. Get your ducks in a row before she knows what hit her. She won't see it coming, Dominic assured them, his confidence built on wine and the echo chamber of his friend's validation. Ruby thinks she's so smart with her presentations and contracts, but she doesn't understand the real game being played here. The real game. The game where he'd been planning to destroy me while sleeping in my bed, eating at my table, living off my success. The game where he'd convinced his friends and probably himself that I was the lucky one in this marriage. I picked up the tray of steaks, now cooled to the point where they'd need reheating. Through the glass, I watched the four of them, these men who'd eaten at my table dozens of times, who'd celebrated holidays in my home, who'd benefited from my hospitality while apparently believing I was beneath their friends' level. The Thursday night gatherings made sense now. Not poker games or strategy sessions, but planning meetings for my humiliation. Every week while I worked late or traveled for business, they'd been reinforcing Dominic's delusions, feeding his ego, helping him construct a narrative where he was the victim of an ungrateful wife's success. I pushed open the French doors with the tray still in my hands, the steaks now cold and forgotten. Four heads snapped toward me in perfect synchronization, their laughter dying mid-breath. Dominic's crystal tumbler stopped halfway to his lips, the amber liquid inside catching the patio lights I'd strung up last summer. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the distant hum of our neighbor's pool filter. Ruby. Dominic's voice cracked on my name, transforming from confident storyteller to caught teenager in a single syllable. We were just... Why wait a year? I set the tray down on the side table with deliberate calm, my voice carrying the same measured tone I used when firing underperforming vendors. Let's end it today. I wouldn't want you to endure another 12 months married to someone so far beneath your level. Nathan's face went white. Trevor suddenly found his phone screen fascinating. Marcus actually took a step backward, nearly knocking over the citronella candle I'd lit earlier to keep mosquitoes away. But Dominic, my husband of 12 years, the man who'd promised to love and honor me in front of 200 guests, just stared at me with his mouth slightly open, no words coming out for once in his life. I turned and walked back through the French doors, leaving them frozen in their tableau of guilt. My footsteps on the hardwood echoed through the house as I headed straight for our bedroom. Behind me, I heard frantic whispers, chairs scraping against concrete, the panic of men who'd been caught not just gossiping but conspiring. The master bedroom closet held my Samsonite luggage set, a gift to myself after closing our first $1 million contract. I pulled out the largest suitcase and laid it open on the bed we'd shared for 5 years in this house. My hands moved with surgical precision, folding blazers I'd worn to meetings Dominic hadn't attended, packing the jewelry I'd bought myself after each major business milestone, gathering the designer bags that represented bonuses he'd claimed were our success while contributing nothing to earning them. From the bathroom, I collected my skincare routine, the expensive serums and creams I'd invested in because taking care of myself was one of the few things I could control while managing a business and a marriage to someone who resented my success. The medicine cabinet held my prescription bottles, vitamins, the sleeping pills I'd needed more frequently as Dominic's Thursday night gatherings had grown longer and louder. I heard footsteps on the stairs, multiple sets, hesitant and uncoordinated. They were coming up like children approaching a parent they'd disappointed, unsure whether they'd face rage or disappointment or something worse, indifference. Ruby, please, can we talk about this? Dominic appeared in the bedroom doorway, his carefully styled hair now disheveled from running his hands through it. Behind him I could see Nathan hovering in the hallway, his face a mix of guilt and something else. Relief maybe? There's nothing to talk about. I zipped my toiletry bag closed and placed it in the suitcase. You've made your position very clear. I'm beneath you. Our marriage is a joke. You've been meeting with Derek Paulson about divorce proceedings. What exactly would you like to discuss? The color drained from his face at the mention of Derek. How did you know about your lawyer? I pulled my laptop bag from the closet, the one containing every password, every client contact, every piece of intellectual property I'd developed for our company. The same way I know about the separate bank account you opened in January. The same way I know you've been telling potential investors that I'm emotionally unstable and hurting the company with my ego. Nathan stepped into view behind Dominic, and something in his expression made everything click into place. The guilt wasn't just about tonight. It was deeper, older, carrying the weight of extended betrayal. It was you, I said, looking directly at Nathan. You sent me that anonymous message an hour ago. Check your husband's Thursday night meetings. You need to know what he's saying about you. Dominic spun around to face his best friend, his face contorting with a rage I'd never seen directed at anyone but me. You warned her. Nathan straightened his shoulders, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked like an adult rather than an overgrown fraternity brother. I've been sending her screenshots for 3 weeks, Dom. Every message in our group chat where you talked about hiding assets. Every discussion about Project Gaslight. Every time you bragged about how you were going to take half of everything Ruby built while painting her as the villain. Project Gaslight? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You actually named it? Like it was some kind of military operation instead of just destroying your wife's reputation. Trevor and Marcus had crept up the stairs, drawn by the drama they'd helped create. They stood in the hallway like actors who'd forgotten their lines, their earlier bravado evaporated in the face of real consequences. The Thursday night gatherings, Nathan continued, his voice gaining strength, were never about poker. They were planning sessions. Dom would tell us his latest strategy for documenting your supposed instability. Taking photos of you working late to prove you were neglecting the marriage. Recording conversations out of context. Building a case that you were the problem while he was the long-suffering husband trying to hold everything together. I folded my last dress, the red one I'd worn to the company Christmas party where Dominic had given a speech about partnership and shared success while I knew he'd contributed nothing to our quarterly numbers. And you all just went along with it? We thought. Marcus started, then stopped, realizing there was no acceptable way to finish that sentence. You thought what? I faced them all, these men who'd eaten at my table, whose birthdays I'd remembered, whose wives I'd consoled through their own marital problems. That it was funny? That it was justified? That I deserved to be destroyed because I had the audacity to be successful? Silence filled the bedroom, heavy and suffocating. Dominic's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his jaw working as he searched for words that might salvage this situation. But we both knew there weren't any. You couldn't unsay what I'd heard. You couldn't undo 3 months of planning my destruction. You couldn't take back she's nowhere near my level, when the evidence of whose level was who stood all around us in the house I'd bought with the money I'd earned. I closed the bedroom door behind me with a soft click that felt louder than any slam could have been. My suitcase wheels whispered against the hallway carpet as I passed the gallery wall of our wedding photos, each frame a monument to promises that had apparently meant nothing to Dominic. Behind the door I could hear raised voices, Dominic turning his fury on Nathan, the very friend who'd finally grown a conscience after 3 months of complicity. The elevator in our building moved with excruciating slowness, giving me too much time to think about what I was leaving behind. Not just the house or the marriage, but the version of myself who'd believed love meant endless compromise, who'd minimized her own achievements to protect a fragile ego, who'd paid bills while pretending not to notice her husband was plotting her downfall with his Thursday night conspirators. The Marriott downtown blazed against the evening sky, its glass facade reflecting the city I'd conquered one client at a time while Dominic played pretend suit. I walked through the lobby with my shoulders straight, refusing to look like a woman fleeing her home. The desk clerk, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional smile, didn't ask questions when I requested an executive suite for a week, paying with the credit card Dominic didn't know existed. My emergency fund, built from bonuses I'd never mentioned because I'd learned years ago that financial independence was oxygen in a suffocating marriage. The suite on the 23rd floor overlooked the business district where tomorrow I'd still have to face the Morrison Industries executives, pretending my life hadn't just imploded. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city lights beginning to twinkle as evening settled over downtown. The space was sterile and perfect. No memories embedded in the furniture, no ghosts of better times haunting the corners, no trace of 18-year scotch or false laughter. My phone had been vibrating continuously since I'd left the house. Dominic's name appeared again and again on the screen, the messages progressing through predictable stages. First, the anger. You're being dramatic. Get back here now. Then the manipulation. You misunderstood everything. We need to talk. The false apology. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. And finally, the threats. You're destroying our company with this stunt. The investors will pull out if they hear about this. I set the phone on the marble bathroom counter and turned on the shower, letting the water heat until steam filled the room. Standing under the rainfall shower head, water cascading over me with a pressure our home shower had never achieved, I finally let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. 12 years. I'd spent 12 years building a life with someone who'd been documenting my destruction, gathering evidence for a war I didn't know we were fighting. The tears came then, mixing with the shower water, my sobs echoing off the marble walls where no one could hear them. I stayed under that water until it ran cold, until my skin was pruned and my eyes were swollen, until I'd cried out not just the betrayal but the humiliation of not seeing it sooner. All those Thursday nights when I'd prepared food for his gatherings. All those mornings when I'd kissed him goodbye before heading to meetings he claimed to support. All those presentations where he'd stood beside me taking credit for work he'd never done. I'd been performing in a play where everyone knew the ending except me. By the time I emerged from the bathroom wrapped in the hotel's plush robe, the sun had fully set. The city below looked different from this height. Smaller, manageable, like a problem that could be solved with the right strategy. I ordered room service. Not because I was hungry but because I needed to remember how to take care of myself without considering someone else's preferences. Salmon not steak. Pinot Grigio not bourbon. A chocolate soufflé because Dominic had always called dessert unnecessary calories, and I'd forgotten what it felt like to be unnecessary. Patricia Winters answered her phone on the second ring, even though it was past 9 o'clock. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd been waiting for this call. I've been expecting to hear from you, Ruby. Nathan Blackstone already sent me an overview of the situation. That stopped me mid-bite of salmon. Nathan contacted you? 2 hours ago. He wants to make sure you have everything you need to protect yourself in the company. He's prepared to provide sworn testimony about Dominic's financial manipulation and the conspiracy to manufacture evidence of instability. Patricia's tone was matter-of-fact, as if husbands plotting their wives' destruction was just another Tuesday in her world. Can you meet me at 8 tomorrow morning? My office. Bring any documentation you have. Bank statements, company records, communication logs. Everything. I agreed, then spent the next 3 hours organizing files on my laptop, creating folders with the kind of detailed labeling that had made our company successful. Dominic's failed ventures contained the documentation of every dollar I'd invested in his dreams. 60,000 in crypto platforms, 40,000 in the meal kit service, 30,000 in the meditation app that never launched. Company contributions held every contract I'd negotiated, every client I'd landed, every late night I'd worked while Dominic's office remained dark. Financial manipulation would soon hold whatever Nathan was about to deliver. At midnight, a knock at my door made me freeze. Through the peephole, I saw Nathan standing in the hallway, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, holding 3 banker's boxes stacked in his arms. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine shame. I opened the door without speaking, stepping aside to let him enter. He set the boxes on the coffee table, then stood awkwardly in the center of the suite, his hands shoved in his pockets like a teenager caught shoplifting. I'm sorry, he said finally. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that watching him poison everyone against you while you were literally keeping the company afloat, it's been eating at me for months. Then why did you go along with it for so long? I asked Nathan, genuinely wanting to understand how someone could watch this manipulation unfold week after week and stay silent. He sank into the hotel suite's armchair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that made him look exhausted. At first I thought he was just venting. You know how guys complain about their marriages. But then it became something else. He started taking notes during your phone calls, screenshotting your texts out of context, building this whole narrative where you were the villain. And we just let him. I opened the first banker's box, finding manila folders labeled in Dominic's handwriting. Financial discrepancies, emotional instability evidence, asset documentation. Inside were printed emails I'd sent him about normal business operations, annotated with his interpretations. A message about working late became proof of marital abandonment. A request to review contracts became controlling behavior. He'd twisted every interaction into evidence for a story that existed only in his mind. This goes back to January, I said, holding up a folder dated 5 months ago. He's been planning this since the beginning of the year. Nathan nodded, unable to meet my eyes. Right after you landed the Samsung contract. That's when he really changed. Before that, he could pretend he was equals with you, but that deal made it clear who was really running things. His ego couldn't handle it. The second box contained something worse. Photographs. Pictures of me at my desk at 10 p.m., taken through the office window. Screenshots of my LinkedIn posts about company growth, highlighted and annotated with comments about my narcissistic need for attention. Even photos from my sister Claire's birthday dinner, where apparently my 2 glasses of wine were evidence of a drinking problem. He asked us to collaborate, Nathan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Trevor was supposed to report if he saw you at lunch with any male clients. Marcus tracked your social media for anything that could be twisted. I was assigned to monitor your relationship with the staff, looking for any signs of what Dominic called inappropriate professional boundaries. The third box was the most damaging. Financial records, but not just ours. Dominic had been setting up a shadow company, registering an LLC in Delaware, even approaching our clients with a new venture he'd be launching soon. The name on the paperwork was Morrison Strategic Solutions, deliberately similar to our company, Morrison Digital Innovations, close enough to confuse clients but different enough to claim coincidence. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Emergency. Dominic just sent an all-staff email claiming you're having a mental health crisis and he's taking temporary control of operations. What should I do? I showed Nathan the message. His face went pale. He's escalating faster than we thought. I called Patricia immediately, putting her on speaker. Dominic just sent a company-wide email claiming I'm having a mental health crisis. Forward it to me immediately, Patricia said, her voice sharp with focus. I'm filing an emergency injunction right now. This crosses into defamation and potential fraud. Nathan, are you there? Yes, he answered, straightening in his chair. I need you to send me everything you have about this supposed Project Gaslight, immediately. Every message, every meeting note, every shred of evidence. Ruby, do not respond to that email. Do not contact your staff directly yet. Let me handle this legally first. After Patricia hung up, Nathan and I worked in silence, organizing documents, creating digital copies, building the case that would protect not just my company but my reputation. At 2 a.m. he finally asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you hate me for not speaking up sooner? I considered lying, offering forgiveness I didn't feel yet. But I was done with polite dishonesty. I don't know what I feel about you, Nathan. You watched my husband plan my destruction for months. You participated in it. The fact that you grew a conscience eventually doesn't erase that. He nodded, accepting the judgment. For what it's worth, Sophie threatened to leave me if I didn't come forward. She said if I could watch this happen to you, she'd never be able to trust me not to do it to her someday. Smart woman, I said, meaning it. Sophie had seen what I'd missed. That someone who could participate in this level of deception was capable of anything. My phone rang at 3 a.m., a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. Ruby, this is Trevor's wife, Linda. Her voice was shaky, like she'd been crying. I just found out what they've been doing. Trevor came home drunk from your house tonight, told me everything. I'm disgusted. I want you to know I have recordings. Recordings? Trevor would come home from those Thursday nights and brag about what they discussed. He thought it was funny watching Dominic plan this elaborate scheme. I started recording him after the 3rd week because something felt wrong. I have hours of him describing their plans, laughing about how you had no idea what was coming. Another ally emerging from an unexpected corner. Can you send them to my lawyer? Already uploaded them to a cloud drive. I'll send you the link. Ruby, I'm filing for divorce too. If Trevor could participate in something this cruel, What else is he capable of? What would he do to me if I ever out-earned him or made him feel small? After Linda hung up, I stood at the window watching the city sleep below. Somewhere out there, Dominic was probably pacing our house, realizing his carefully constructed plan was collapsing. His friends were turning on him. His lawyer would see the evidence and advise surrender. The staff he'd tried to manipulate would choose the person who'd actually built their careers. Nathan stood to leave at 4 a.m., gathering his coat with movements that seemed to hurt. At the door he turned back one more time. The ironical thing is Dominic was never below your level, Ruby. You would have carried him forever if he'd just been grateful instead of resentful. You loved him enough to make him equal even when he wasn't. That's what he never understood. I closed the door behind Nathan and stood alone in my hotel suite, watching the sun begin to rise over the city. 4 hours of sleep would have to be enough. Today's investor meeting would determine not just the future of my company, but whether Dominic's carefully crafted narrative would collapse under the weight of evidence. I showered quickly, chose my sharpest black suit, the one I'd worn when closing the Samsung deal, and applied makeup to hide the exhaustion that threatened to show through. Patricia called as I was leaving the hotel. The emergency injunction went through. Dominic is legally barred from accessing company accounts or making any operational decisions without board approval. He'll receive notice this morning, probably right before the meeting. He's going to be furious. Let him be. Anger makes people sloppy. I've also sent the evidence package to each board member individually. They'll have had time to review it before you all gather. The office building stood against the morning sky like a monument to everything I'd built. I arrived at 6 a.m., using my key card to enter through the executive entrance. The building was nearly empty, just security and the overnight cleaning crew who nodded in recognition. They'd seen me here at all hours over the years, unlike Dominic, whose badge rarely registered activity before 10 a.m. Nathan was already in the conference room, arranging printed documents with methodical precision. He'd changed clothes but hadn't slept either, judging by the coffee cups already accumulating on the side table. We worked without speaking at first, creating stations of evidence around the room, financial records at one end, client testimonials at another. The Project Gaslight documentation prominently displayed where Dominic would have to face it. He'll try to spin this as a marital dispute that shouldn't affect business, Nathan said, adjusting the projection screen. That's his opening move. Make it personal, not professional. And when he does? That's when you show slide 17, his LLC filing for the competing company. Nothing says, professional betrayal, like trying to poach your own clients while still drawing a salary. Sarah arrived at 8 a.m. with her laptop and a grim expression. Half the staff is ready to testify if needed. The other half is updating their resumes in case this goes badly. It won't go badly, I said with more confidence than I felt. Not for them anyway. The board members began arriving at 9:30 a.m. Margaret Chin first, her expression unreadable as she nodded to me before taking her seat. James Harrison from our biggest client account, technically not a board member but invited given his company's stake in our stability. 2 other investors, Robert Kim and David Okonkwo, both of whom had questioned Dominic's contributions during previous meetings only to be met with his deflection and my diplomatic interventions. At 9:55 a.m., Patricia entered and sat beside me, her presence a clear signal that this was no longer just a business discussion. The legal implications hung in the air like a threat. At exactly 10 a.m., Dominic walked in wearing the Tom Ford suit I'd bought him for our 10th anniversary, the one he'd worn to accept an industry award for work I'd done while he was in Cabo. His cologne preceded him, the same expensive scent he'd worn to every meeting where he'd taken credit for my achievements. He paused when he saw the room's configuration. Nathan beside me instead of with him, Patricia's presence, the board's serious expressions. His eyes found Nathan, and the look that passed between them could have frozen fire. Nathan didn't flinch, though I saw his jaw tighten. Dominic recovered quickly, his salesman's smile sliding into place as he took his seat. I appreciate everyone gathering on short notice, Dominic began, pulling out note cards he'd obviously prepared. I know there have been concerns about recent disruptions to our leadership structure. I want to assure you that despite my wife's current emotional state. I'll stop you right there, Margaret Chin interrupted, her voice cutting through his performance like a blade. We've reviewed the documentation provided by Mrs. Morrison's legal counsel. Your claims about her mental state appear to be not just unfounded but deliberately fabricated. Dominic's smile flickered. I understand Ruby has painted a certain picture. The picture was painted by your own messages, Mr. Morrison. David Okonkwo held up a printed screenshot. This group chat where you discuss Project Gaslight? Where you strategize about documenting false evidence of instability. These are your words, are they not? I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, displaying Dominic's message from 6 weeks ago. Keep documenting everything. We need to show a pattern of erratic behavior even if we have to create it. The room went silent. Dominic's face cycled through emotions. Shock that his private messages were exposed, anger at Nathan's betrayal, and finally, the desperate calculation of someone trying to salvage an unsalvageable situation. Those messages were taken out of context. He tried. Nathan clearly has his own agenda here. My agenda, Nathan spoke for the first time, his voice steady, is making sure the truth is known. For 3 months, I watched you plan to destroy the woman who built this company while you contributed nothing but obstruction and stolen credit. You were part of it. Dominic burst out, revealing more than he intended. You sat there every Thursday participating, encouraging. Yes, Nathan said simply. I did. And I was wrong. The difference is I'm trying to make it right. I advanced to the next slide. Financial records showing every major contract, color-coded by who had actually closed the deal. My column was solid blue. Dominic's was empty white space. Over the past 24 months, I began, my voice carrying the authority I'd earned through actual achievement. I've personally closed 17 major contracts totaling $32 million in revenue. During that same period, Mr. Morrison has closed 0 contracts while drawing a salary of $400,000 annually. James Harrison leaned forward. Ruby, we need to be clear about something. Harrison Tech has never considered Dominic a factor in our decision to work with your company. Every strategic discussion, every campaign adjustment, every innovation has come from you. We've tolerated his presence in meetings out of respect for you, but he's never contributed a single valuable insight. The blood drained from Dominic's face as he realized his largest client had just publicly dismissed his entire professional existence. Dominic's mouth opened and closed silently, searching for words that could counter James Harrison's dismissal. The conference room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in on a man who'd just discovered his professional reputation was a fiction only he believed. I clicked to the next slide, showing the registration documents for Morrison Strategic Solutions, his shadow company designed to steal our clients. This concludes my presentation, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The board has all the evidence needed to make an informed decision about the company's future leadership structure. Derek Paulson, Dominic's own attorney, had been silent throughout the presentation, his expression growing increasingly grim with each revealed document. Now he leaned forward, addressing his client with the detached professionalism of someone cutting their losses. Dominic, we need to discuss your options privately, Derek said, already gathering his papers. The message was clear. The legal battle Dominic had been planning was over before it began. Margaret Chin stood, smoothing her skirt with deliberate precision. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning to formalize the transition. Mr. Morrison, I suggest you use the time to consider Patricia's buyout offer carefully. It's more generous than what a court might determine given this evidence. The meeting dissolved with the awkward shuffle of people fleeing an uncomfortable scene. Dominic remained seated, staring at the projection screen where his own words about Project Gaslight still glowed accusingly. Nathan paused at the door, looking back at his former friend with something between pity and relief, then left without speaking. That evening, alone in my hotel suite with Chinese takeout growing cold on the coffee table, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day's confrontation. Ruby? This is Linda Chin, Trevor's wife. Her voice carried the tremor of someone who'd been crying. I need to tell you something about what's been happening in your absence. I set down my chopsticks, suddenly alert. Linda and I had spoken perhaps 5 times in 8 years. Always pleasant but superficial conversations at group dinners. Trevor came home from the investor meeting today, she continued, and he was different. He told me everything about what they'd been doing to you, but Ruby, it's worse than you know. Dominic had been coaching all of them on how to handle their wives. He called it maintaining frame and strategic relationship management. My stomach turned. What do you mean, coaching them? I found Trevor's journal. Pages and pages of Dominic's advice. How to document your wife's spending to make her look irresponsible. How to gaslight her about social situations, making her doubt her memory. How to position yourself as the rational one while painting her as emotional and unstable. Trevor's been using these tactics on me for months and I thought I was going crazy. The parallel destruction of marriages. Dominic hadn't just been planning my downfall. He'd been teaching his friends to destroy their own wives' confidence and credibility. A masterclass in manipulation disguised as Thursday night poker games. I showed Trevor the journal, Linda continued, her voice stronger now. Made him read his own words back to me. The look on his face when he realized what Dominic had turned him into. Ruby, I've never seen my husband cry before today. What's he going to do? He's cutting Dominic out completely. He's also agreed to couples counseling, though I'm not sure our marriage will survive this. How do you rebuild trust when someone's been systematically undermining you with coaching from your friend? After Linda hung up, I sat in the darkness of my suite, city lights twinkling below like distant stars. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. You need to see what's happening at the country club. She'd attached a photo someone had sent her. Dominic, disheveled and clearly intoxicated, holding court at the bar with anyone who would listen. Even in the grainy image you could see the other patrons leaning away, the bartender's expression of professional patience wearing thin. Barbara Fitzgerald called an hour later. The judge's wife was connected to everyone who mattered in our social circle, a woman who collected information like others collected art. I was at the club this evening, she said without preamble. Dominic's been there every day since your separation became public. Today he was telling people he built your company single-handedly, that you were just a pretty face he used for client meetings. The delusion was so complete that even strangers were exchanging concerned looks. Did anyone believe him? Barbara laughed, a sharp sound that contained no humor. The bartender told me Dominic's rants have become entertainment for the regular afternoon crowd. They call it story time with Dom, and take bets on which accomplishment he'll claim next. Yesterday he said he invented a revolutionary trading algorithm. Today it was a meditation app that Apple tried to buy for millions. The man I'd married was dissolving into a caricature of himself, his lies growing more elaborate as his reality crumbled. Part of me felt the sharp satisfaction of watching karma unfold in real time. Another part, buried deeper, mourned the person he might have been if ego hadn't consumed him. My phone buzzed again. A Facebook message from Emma Rodriguez, Marcus's girlfriend. I'd met her twice at dinner parties, remembered her as quiet but observant, the kind of person who noticed everything while saying little. I need you to know what Marcus was planning with Dominic, her message read. I'm ending things with him, but you deserve to see this first. Attached were screenshots that made my blood run cold. Detailed plans for approaching our clients after the divorce, claiming I'd had a breakdown, offering to maintain continuity through Dominic's new agency. They drafted emails, created a timeline for client poaching, even designed logos that deliberately mimicked our company's branding. But the worst part was the list of employees they planned to recruit, with notes about each person's vulnerabilities. Sarah, single mom, needs stability, will follow the money. Kevin, desperate for promotion, easy to manipulate with promises. They'd studied my team like predators studying prey. Emma's final message arrived as I was processing the screenshots. Marcus doesn't know I have these. I'm sending them to your lawyer too. No woman should have to deal with this level of betrayal. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. The fumbling attempt at corporate theft would have been pathetic if it wasn't so malicious. I forwarded Emma's screenshots to Patricia immediately, my fingers steady despite the rage burning through my chest. The evidence of planned corporate theft transformed our civil divorce into something potentially criminal. Patricia responded within minutes. This changes everything. We're adding fraud charges to our leverage. He'll have to accept whatever terms we offer now. 6 months crawled by with the painful slowness of recovery. I moved from the hotel suite to a furnished apartment downtown, needing space that had never known Dominic's presence. The company stabilized and then thrived without his interference, landing 3 new major clients who'd been hesitant to commit while our leadership situation remained uncertain. Nathan proved himself invaluable as director of operations, his guilt driving him to work harder than anyone else, though I still couldn't look at him without remembering those 3 months of complicit silence. The morning of our divorce finalization arrived gray and drizzling, weather that matched the strange melancholy of officially ending something that had been dead for months. I dressed carefully in a new suit, one Dominic had never seen, applying makeup that emphasized strength rather than softness. Patricia met me in the lobby of her building, her expression professionally neutral but her hand briefly squeezing my shoulder in support. The conference room smelled of leather and old coffee, windows overlooking the city where I'd rebuilt my life. Dominic was already there when we entered and the transformation stopped me mid-step. The man who'd once strutted through life in Tom Ford suits now wore a basic button-down from Target, wrinkled at the elbows. His face had thinned dramatically, 40 pounds gone along with his delusions of grandeur. The BMW he'd loved more than our marriage had been replaced with a decade-old Honda, according to Patricia's investigator. His hands shook as he held the pen. His attorney, the third one he'd hired after Derek dropped him and the second quit, looked like someone fresh from law school, probably working for a fraction of what Derek had charged. The young man kept checking his notes, clearly overwhelmed by Patricia's presence and the mountain of evidence we'd compiled. "The terms remain as discussed," Patricia said, sliding the final settlement across the table. "Mrs. Morrison retains full ownership of Morrison Digital Innovations, all associated intellectual property, the house and all investment accounts. Mr. Morrison receives his personal belongings, the cryptocurrency wallets from his failed ventures, and his grandfather's watch. No alimony. No future claims on the business. The non-compete clause stands for 5 years within the digital marketing industry." Dominic's signature looked like a child's scrawl, nothing like the confident flourish he'd once used on contracts he hadn't earned. He couldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at the table where his dreams of stealing half my empire had died. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I know you won't believe me, but I'm sorry." I looked at him, then really looked at him, this hollow shell of the man who'd once charmed me with false confidence and borrowed dreams. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't believe you." He signed the last page and left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like a funeral march for the person he'd pretended to be. 2 weeks later, the Forbes journalist arrived at our offices with a photographer and an agenda to tell what she called the story of the year. Catherine Wells was sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of reporter who saw through surface presentations to find deeper truths. She didn't want to hear about quarterly projections or market strategies. She wanted the raw truth about discovering betrayal and transforming it into fuel for success. "Tell me about the night you found out," she said, her recorder placed between us on the conference table where Dominic had once claimed my achievements as his own. I told her everything. The Thursday night gathering where I'd stood holding stakes while my husband called our marriage a joke. Nathan's conscience finally awakening after 3 months of complicity. The Project Gaslight documents that revealed systematic planning to destroy my reputation. The way my team had rallied around me while Dominic's friends abandoned him one by one. "What strikes me," Catherine said, making notes in shorthand I couldn't read, "is that you didn't seek revenge. You simply revealed the truth and let consequences unfold naturally. The best revenge is building something so successful that the person who tried to destroy you becomes irrelevant," I replied. Dominic thought I was beneath his level. Now he's working at a startup in Buffalo while I'm running a company valued at $12 million. The universe has its own sense of justice. Her article would run with the headline, "How Ruby Morrison Built a Digital Empire While Divorcing Dead Weight," and reached 2 million readers in its first week. My inbox flooded with messages from women sharing similar stories, thanking me for showing them what survival looked like when transformed into success. A month after the divorce finalized, a handwritten letter arrived at the office, forwarded from an address in Buffalo. Dominic's handwriting, shaky now where it had once been confident, filled 3 pages with what he probably thought was an apology. But even in his attempt at remorse, the delusion persisted. He wrote about our success, about how he'd helped build the company, about being a victim of circumstances, rather than the architect of his own destruction. He actually suggested that maybe once emotions had cooled we could discuss him consulting for the company. His expertise he claimed could still add value. I filed the letter in a folder marked evidence/closed, and locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not because I needed it anymore, but as a reminder that some people could stand in the ruins of their own making and still believe they were the hero of the story. The company holiday party that year took place at Vincenzo's, the Italian restaurant where Dominic had once held court with clients he hadn't earned. I'd reserved the entire upper floor, wanting to celebrate not just our financial success but our collective survival. Sarah had organized everything perfectly, from the wine selection to the seating arrangements that kept the most talkative employees strategically separated. As dinner wound down and wine loosened tongues, Sarah stood to make a toast. I expected something about quarterly numbers or client wins. Instead, she raised her glass with tears in her eyes. To survival, she said simply. And to leaders who earn their titles instead of stealing them. The toast hung in the air as glasses clinked around the restaurant's upper floor. Then unexpectedly, our CFO Margaret stood up, her voice wavering with emotion I'd never seen from her in 5 years of working together. "Since we're sharing," she began, gripping her wine glass like an anchor, "my ex-husband convinced me I was terrible with numbers. Me. With a master's degree in accounting. He'd check my work, question every calculation, make me doubt myself until I nearly quit finance altogether. It took 2 years of therapy after our divorce to realize he was threatened by my salary being higher than his." Kevin, our lead developer, cleared his throat. "My college girlfriend used to introduce me as playing with computers when I was building the app that eventually sold to Microsoft. She said real jobs required wearing suits." The stories poured out like water through a broken dam. Every person in that room had been diminished by someone who claimed to love them. We weren't just colleagues anymore. We were survivors of the same war fought on different battlefields. The evening transformed from a corporate celebration into something deeper. A recognition that Dominic's behavior wasn't unique, just another verse in an old, tired song that too many of us had been forced to hear. 11 months later, the invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering: Nathan and Sophie's wedding. I'd debated attending, the wound of his complicity still tender despite his eventual help. But Sophie had called personally, her voice warm and genuine. "You saved us both," she'd said. "Nathan from becoming someone I couldn't love, and me from marrying that person." The ceremony took place at a vineyard outside the city, rows of grapes stretching toward mountains painted purple by the setting sun. I sat 3 rows back, close enough to see but not so close as to claim a friendship we no longer had. Nathan looked nervous in his navy suit, constantly adjusting his tie until Sophie appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in simple ivory silk. During the reception, after the traditional toasts from family, Nathan stood unexpectedly, tapping his champagne flute for attention. The tent fell silent, 200 guests turning toward him with expectant smiles. But his eyes found mine across the room, and I knew this speech wasn't for them. "Before I talk about Sophie," he began, his voice carrying the weight of practiced words, "I need to address something. 11 months ago I participated in something shameful. I watched a friend plan to destroy his wife's reputation and career, and I not only stayed silent, I helped. I took screenshots. I documented conversations. I enabled a man's delusions because it was easier than confronting the truth." The silence in the tent became absolute. Sophie stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her expression proud rather than embarrassed. "Ruby Morrison is here tonight," Nathan continued, and head swiveled to find me. "She built an empire while her husband planned her downfall. She showed grace when I finally found my conscience at the 11th hour. But the real hero of this story is my wife, Sophie, who told me that night that if I didn't warn Ruby immediately, she would leave me. She said, and I'll never forget this, 'If you can watch this happen to her, how do I know you won't do it to me someday?'" The applause started slowly, then built to something thunderous. Sophie kissed Nathan's cheek, whispered something that made him smile, and I raised my glass in acknowledgement of an apology I hadn't expected but somehow needed. Later, as the band played and couples swayed under string lights, Sophie found me at the bar. "He tortures himself about those 3 months," she said quietly. "Wakes up sometimes asking what would have happened if he'd spoken up sooner." "What happened happened," I replied, meaning it. "We all got where we needed to be." 3 weeks later, planning Mom's 70th birthday party became my focus. The country club's event coordinator, the same woman who'd handled Dominic's and my anniversary party 2 years ago, didn't mention the irony as we selected menus and flower arrangements. The grand ballroom would host 80 guests, 3 generations of Morrison women and the people who'd supported us through triumphs and disasters. The night of the party, Mom stood at the center of the room in elegant navy, surrounded by her sisters, my cousins, my teenage niece Lily who'd just won a coding competition. Looking at them, I saw our family's evolution. My grandmother's generation who'd been told to be grateful for any opportunity, my mother's generation who'd worked twice as hard for half the recognition, my generation fighting for equality while juggling tradition, and Lily's generation who simply expected fairness as their birthright. Mom pulled me aside near the dessert table, champagne making her more honest than usual. I saw it, she said quietly. How Dominic dismissed your achievements, took credit for your work. I should have said something. Why didn't you? She looked across the room at my father, steady and supportive after 45 years. My generation was taught that marriage was private, that interference caused more harm than help. I was wrong. Watching you rebuild, seeing you thrive, I should have spoken up when he first started diminishing you. I might not have listened, I admitted. Sometimes we need to discover truth ourselves. Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Mom's party, I was selecting olive oil at Whole Foods when I saw him. Dominic stood in the pasta aisle, comparing prices on generic brands with the focus of someone counting every dollar. His suit from Target had seen better days, the hem of his pants slightly frayed. The wedding ring I'd placed on his finger 5 years ago was gone, leaving a pale indent on his tan line. He looked up, our eyes meeting across 15 feet of organic produce and broken promises. For a moment he started to move toward me, his mouth opening as if to speak. But something in my expression, not hatred, not anger, just complete indifference, stopped him mid-step. I looked through him as if he were transparent, then returned to examining olive oil labels. He abandoned his half-full cart in the aisle and walked quickly toward the exit, his shoulders hunched like someone fleeing a crime scene. I continued shopping, adding items for the dinner party I was hosting that weekend for potential investors in my second company, a venture Dominic would read about in business journals he could no longer afford. If Ruby's rise from betrayal to brilliance had you hooked till the last line, smash that like button right now. My favorite moment was when she looked through Dominic in that grocery aisle. Pure, quiet power. What was your favorite scene? Tell me in the comments below. And don't miss more stories of strength, justice, and sweet redemption. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. I went to a party with my husband. He left with another woman because she's rich. He tossed his car keys at me and laughed, "Find your own way home." The next morning his phone wouldn't stop ringing, his mistress was crying, and he stood frozen at the door, realizing something he never expected. For 15 years I told myself that marriage requires compromise. That not every slight deserves confrontation. That maintaining peace is more important than defending pride. I told myself these things while my husband gradually erased me from his professional life, introduced me as someone who does bookkeeping instead of someone who runs a successful consulting practice, and spent our children's college fund on hotel rooms with a woman whose family owned half of Connecticut. I am Catherine Brennan, 42 years old, and I am very good at lying to myself when the truth is too uncomfortable to face. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories of dignity reclaimed and justice served. If you believe that betrayal deserves accountability, please consider subscribing. It helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. My specialty is financial restructuring for small businesses on the brink of collapse. Companies hire me when their revenue statements do not match their bank balances, when money disappears into gaps they cannot explain, when they suspect someone is stealing but lack proof. I analyze their books with surgical precision, identifying exactly where funds are being diverted and why their financial structure no longer supports their operations. I am excellent at this work because I understand how people hide theft behind legitimate-looking transactions, how they exploit trust to create plausible deniability, how they convince themselves that what they are doing is not really wrong if nobody notices. The irony is almost funny. I can spot financial deception in a corporate ledger within hours, but I missed it in my own marriage for 18 months. My husband Edward sells luxury cars to wealthy clients who view $70,000 vehicles as reasonable purchases. He is charming in that practiced way that makes people believe they are special, that their connection with him is unique, that he genuinely cares about their satisfaction rather than his commission. He has been using these same skills on me for years. And I let him because the alternative was admitting that the life I built was constructed on foundations that were never as solid as I believed. Thursday evening, he walked into my office and told me I needed to attend his dealership's anniversary gala on Saturday. After 3 years of excluding me from his professional world, this sudden requirement should have triggered every alarm system in my body. It did trigger them. I just ignored the warnings because I had become very skilled at pretending everything was fine. 2 days later, I stood in a parking lot at midnight holding car keys my husband had thrown at my chest, watching him drive away with another woman, and I finally stopped lying to myself about what my marriage had become. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up in that parking lot, you need to understand what I was before that moment. You need to see the life I convinced myself was worth protecting, even as it slowly poisoned everything I touched. My home in suburban Connecticut looks like it belongs in a design magazine. White picket fence that Edward insisted on installing 5 years ago because successful people have white picket fences. Hydrangeas that bloom reliably every spring because I researched the correct soil composition and fertilization schedule and followed the instructions with the same precision I apply to balance sheets. Interior walls painted in fashionable neutral tones that Edward selected to impress the colleagues he occasionally brought home for cocktails before he stopped bringing anyone home at all. Everything curated. Everything intentional. Everything designed to project an image of stability and achievement that had nothing to do with the reality happening inside those carefully painted walls. Our daughter Olivia is 14, brilliant in that quiet way that often gets overlooked in a world that rewards volume over substance. She watches everything with dark eyes that miss nothing, absorbing information and drawing conclusions she keeps locked behind a careful mask of teenage indifference. 2 months ago she asked me why Dad does not eat dinner with us anymore. I gave her the standard explanation about his demanding work schedule, about important clients who required evening attention, about how successful people sometimes have to sacrifice family time for professional obligations. She looked at me with an expression that was far too knowing for a 14-year-old and said nothing, which somehow felt worse than if she had challenged my lies directly. Her silence was judgment. Her silence was understanding that I was protecting a fiction neither of us believed anymore. Our son James is 11, still open and affectionate in ways that boys his age are beginning to outgrow under social pressure to appear tough and unbothered. He hugs me when he comes home from school and tells me about his day with enthusiastic detail about lunch trades and playground politics and the chapter book his teacher is reading aloud during quiet time. 3 weeks ago he asked why Mom and Dad do not laugh together like his friend Mason's parents do. I told him that adults just get quieter as they get older, that it is normal and nothing to worry about, that love changes shape over time but remains steady underneath the surface changes. The words tasted like poison in my mouth even as I spoke them. My parents have been married 47 years and still hold hands when they walk through the grocery store. They still finish each other's sentences and share private jokes and look at each other like they are seeing something precious that nobody else can fully appreciate. I know what a real partnership looks like. I know what enduring affection feels like when it is genuine rather than performed. And I know with absolute certainty that what Edward and I have is not that and has not been that for longer than I want to calculate. But admitting that truth meant acknowledging that I had wasted 15 years building something that was already crumbling beneath me. It meant accepting that I had been so focused on maintaining the appearance of success that I had ignored the structural failures threatening to collapse everything. It meant facing the reality that I had become exactly like the failing businesses I consult for, the ones that keep operating long past the point when any reasonable analysis would recommend closure, the ones that cling to past success while ignoring present disaster. The shift in Edward's behavior happened so gradually that I could convince myself I was imagining the changes. 3 years ago he stopped inviting me to dealership events. He claimed I made his colleagues uncomfortable with my direct questions about sales practices and commission structures, that the luxury automotive world required a social fluency I simply did not possess, that my tendency toward blunt communication clashed with the subtle dance of high-end sales. I accepted this explanation because it aligned with how I saw myself. I am more comfortable with spreadsheets than cocktail parties. I am more at home analyzing financial statements than navigating small talk about golf handicaps and vacation homes in the Hamptons. I do not enjoy the performance of wealth and status that seems to dominate Edward's professional world. But acceptance of his explanation became acceptance of my exclusion, and exclusion became invisibility. Edward began staying late at work multiple nights each week, always with plausible explanations about difficult clients or important deals that required extra attention. He started dressing better, wearing cologne I had not purchased for him, checking his phone with increasing frequency and decreasing transparency. When I asked about his day, his answers became vague and dismissive, as though the details of his life were too complicated or too important for me to understand. Our conversations shrank to logistics about children's schedules and household maintenance, the kind of functional exchanges between roommates rather than partners who once stayed up past midnight talking about dreams and fears and the future we would build together. I noticed all of this. I documented it mentally the same way I document financial irregularities in client accounts. I saw the pattern emerging. But I chose to interpret it as natural marital evolution rather than systematic erasure, because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. Edward Brennan works at Meridian Luxury Imports, a dealership that caters to Connecticut's wealthiest residents. He sells vehicles that cost more than most families earn in a year. He wears custom suits that probably cost more than the used sedan I drive to client meetings. He maintains relationships with country club members whose names appear in business journals and society pages. He speaks fluently in the language of aspiration and exclusivity, convincing clients that the right automobile will elevate not just their transportation but their entire social standing. I used to find this skill impressive. Now I recognize it as practiced manipulation applied to everyone he encounters, including his own wife. He has been selling me a version of our marriage the same way he sells luxury vehicles, emphasizing the features I want to believe in while carefully concealing the defects that would make me question the value of what I am getting. And I bought it. For 15 years I bought every word. Thursday evening, Edward walked into my home office where I was finishing a financial analysis for a client in Stamford. He still wore his work clothes, the charcoal suit that made him look like he belonged in boardrooms rather than showrooms, the Italian leather shoes he insisted were business necessities rather than vanity purchases. He stood in the doorway with that carefully neutral expression he uses when he wants something but does not want to reveal how much it matters to him. "You need to come to the dealership anniversary gala this Saturday," he said. Not an invitation. Not a request. A requirement delivered as established fact. I looked up from the spreadsheet on my computer screen. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten with instinctive warning. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual even though my pulse had started racing with alarm I could not quite justify. "Why now after 3 years? The managing director's wife will be there," he said, as though this explained everything. "It looks better if we attend as couples. You understand." I did not understand. But I nodded anyway because that is what I had learned to do over 15 years of marriage. Accept non-explanations and pretend they make sense. Swallow questions that might create conflict. Maintain the fiction that everything is fine because acknowledging problems means doing something about them, and doing something about them means facing truths I was not ready to face. So I agreed to attend the gala. I agreed to put on a dress and smile beside my husband and pretend we were the partnership we had stopped being years ago. I agreed because refusing would have required admitting that something was catastrophically wrong, and I was not ready for that admission yet. I wish I could say I sensed the danger waiting for me at that event. But the truth is simpler and more pathetic. I was just grateful that Edward wanted me there at all, that after 3 years of exclusion I was finally being invited back into his professional world, even if the invitation came as a demand rather than a desire. 2 days later, everything I had been pretending not to see would become impossible to ignore. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that makes Connecticut look like a postcard. Clear skies. Crisp air. Leaves turning gold and crimson in that precise way that real estate agents photograph for luxury property listings. Edward spent 40 minutes getting ready, adjusting his tie 3 times and applying cologne with more care than I had seen him take with his appearance in months. I watched him from the bedroom doorway and felt that familiar tightness in my chest that I had learned to ignore, the physical manifestation of instincts I refused to acknowledge. I wore the navy silk dress I had purchased 3 years ago for a client's wedding. It was the nicest piece of clothing I owned, elegant in a timeless way that does not go out of style because it was never quite in style to begin with. I paired it with simple jewelry and practical heels that would not leave me limping by the end of the evening. When I looked in the mirror I saw someone professional and presentable. When I looked at Edward in his custom suit and Italian leather shoes, I saw someone who belonged to a different world entirely. The drive to Brookfield Country Club took 30 minutes through suburban streets lined with homes that increased in size and grandeur the closer we got to our destination. Edward drove in silence, checking his phone at red lights with the kind of focused attention that suggested the messages he was reading mattered more than anything happening in the car with his wife. I stared out the window and tried to remember the last time we had driven somewhere together without the children as a buffer between us. I could not recall a single instance in the past year. The Brookfield Country Club exists in a different economic reality than the one I inhabit. The building itself is a monument to inherited wealth, designed to intimidate anyone who was not born understanding the codes and customs of established privilege. Mahogany-paneled walls displayed photographs of members from generations past, all of them white and wealthy and wearing expressions that suggested they had never once questioned their right to occupy exclusive spaces. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors polished to mirror brightness. The air smelled like expensive perfume and old money, that particular combination of leather and wood polish and entitlement that seems to permeate establishments where membership requires both substantial wealth and the correct ancestral connections. I felt immediately viscerally out of place. My dress, which had seemed perfectly appropriate when I put it on at home, now looked shabby beside the designer gowns surrounding me. Women wore clothing that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, jewelry that required insurance riders, shoes that were probably custom-made in Italian workshops I had never heard of. They moved through the space with the confidence of people who had been attending events like this since childhood, who understood instinctively which fork to use and which topics were appropriate for polite conversation and how to laugh at jokes that were not actually funny but served some social function I did not comprehend. Edward transformed the moment we walked through those doors. It was not a gradual shift but an immediate and complete metamorphosis, like watching someone put on a mask they had worn so many times it fit more comfortably than their actual face. His posture straightened. His smile widened into something that looked genuine but felt calculated. His voice took on that particular tone he uses with wealthy clients, warm and engaging and just slightly deferential, suggesting that he recognized their importance while implying that he was sophisticated enough to move in their circles as an equal rather than a servant. He worked the room with practiced efficiency, moving from group to group with the timing of someone who understands exactly how long to stay in each conversation before moving to the next opportunity. I followed slightly behind him like an accessory he had reluctantly brought along, smiling politely at people whose names I forgot the moment I heard them. Edward introduced me the same way each time. "This is my wife, Catherine. She does bookkeeping for small businesses." The phrasing was deliberate. Not financial consulting. Not business restructuring. Bookkeeping. A word that suggested I sat in small offices helping shopkeepers balance their registers, rather than analyzing complex financial structures for companies with multi-million-dollar revenues. I should have corrected him. I should have explained that I run a successful consulting practice specializing in corporate financial analysis and restructuring. But I said nothing because correcting Edward in front of his colleagues felt like starting a fight I did not have the energy for, and because some part of me had internalized his assessment that my work was not impressive enough to warrant accurate description. The ballroom filled steadily as more guests arrived. I accepted a glass of wine from a passing server and positioned myself near a decorative column where I could observe without being required to participate. Edward had already moved away from me, absorbed in conversation with a group of men wearing suits that probably cost more than my car. They laughed at something he said, and I watched him glow with the validation of being accepted into their circle, of being treated as though he belonged among people whose wealth dwarfed his own. Then she walked in and everything changed. Vanessa Whitmore did not simply enter the ballroom. She commanded its attention with the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never once in your entire life questioning whether you belong somewhere. She was stunning in that carefully constructed way that requires both genetic advantage and substantial financial investment. Her hair fell in perfect waves that could only be achieved through professional styling. Her dress was clearly custom designed rather than purchased from any rack, fitting her body with the precision that only bespoke tailoring can achieve. Her jewelry sparkled with genuine stones that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in calculated brilliance. But what struck me most was not her appearance. It was the immediate transformation in Edward when he spotted her. His entire face changed. The professional mask he had been wearing since we arrived fell away, replaced by something raw and unguarded. His expression illuminated with an intensity one had not witnessed directed at me in years. perhaps ever. He looked at Vanessa Whitmore the way I had always hoped someone would look at me, the way romantic movies promised was possible if you found the right person. He looked at her like she was the only person in the room who mattered. They gravitated toward each other like magnets, crossing the ballroom with the inevitability of objects following natural laws. When they met, Vanessa placed her hand on Edward's arm with casual intimacy, and he leaned close to hear something she said in a voice too low for anyone else to catch. They laughed together, and it was the kind of genuine laughter that comes from shared understanding rather than social obligation. I stood by my decorative column and watched my husband fall into conversation with another woman as though I did not exist. As though the past 15 years had never happened. As though our 2 children and our mortgage and our shared history were irrelevant details that could be dismissed when something more interesting appeared. Edward eventually remembered I existed and brought Vanessa over for introductions. "This is Catherine," he said, gesturing toward me with the same enthusiasm he might use when pointing out a piece of furniture. "Not my wife Catherine. Not Catherine Brennan, who runs a successful consulting practice. Just Catherine, as though I were a distant acquaintance rather than the woman he had been married to for 15 years. "Lovely to meet you," Vanessa said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Her hand was still on Edward's arm, and I noticed she wore a bracelet that probably cost more than everything I owned combined. I learned through fragments of overheard conversations over the next hour that Vanessa Whitmore represented generational wealth that dwarfed even the substantial fortunes present in that room. Her family owned Whitmore Development Corporation, a real estate empire spanning the entire Northeast Corridor. She was recently divorced from her second husband, apparently seeking diversions, and had developed an interest in luxury vehicles that brought her frequently to Meridian Imports, where Edward served as her personal sales consultant. Personal sales consultant. The phrase echoed in my head with implications I was not quite ready to examine. The evening deteriorated from there with the slow inevitability of a car accident you can see coming but cannot prevent. Edward and Vanessa disappeared together twice, each absence carefully staged to appear innocent but fooling absolutely no one who was paying attention. The first time, Edward claimed they needed to discuss specifications for her new vehicle order and would step out to the terrace where they could talk without the ballroom noise. They were gone 25 minutes. When they returned, Vanessa's lipstick was slightly smudged, and Edward's tie had been loosened in a way that suggested hands other than his own had been involved in its adjustment. The second disappearance happened near the bar. Edward said something about getting fresh drinks, and Vanessa laughed and said she would help him carry them back. This should have taken 3 minutes. It took 20. I stood alone near my decorative column, nursing the same glass of wine I had been holding for an hour, pretending I did not notice the pitying glances from other wives or the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I moved within earshot. One woman looked at me with genuine sympathy before her husband quickly guided her away, clearly unwilling to become involved in someone else's marital drama. I later learned her name was Margaret Ashford, and she would play an unexpected role in what came next. But in that moment she was just another witness to my public humiliation. The evening had taken on a surreal quality, as though I were watching someone else's life fall apart from a great distance. I observed with strange clinical detachment how thoroughly and publicly my husband was displaying his preference for another woman. I considered leaving. I could call a car service. I could simply walk out of this ballroom and never look back. But some stubborn part of me refused to give Edward that satisfaction, refused to slink away like I had done something wrong, refused to let him rewrite this narrative as though I were the problem rather than the victim. So I stayed. I stood by my column and watched my marriage end in real time while crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead and waiters circulated with expensive hors d'oeuvres and everyone pretended not to notice what was happening. At 11 o'clock, as the event was concluding and guests began gathering coats and saying goodbyes, Edward approached me with Vanessa beside him. His expression carried a mixture of excitement and something else I could not immediately identify. Perhaps guilt. Perhaps triumph. Perhaps simple indifference to how this moment might affect the woman he had promised to love and honor 15 years ago. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his car keys and tossed them at me with casual dismissiveness. They hit my chest before I caught them reflexively. The metal was cold and heavy against my palms. "Find your own way home," Edward said. His voice was deliberately loud enough that several nearby couples turned to observe this public rejection. Vanessa's offering to show me her new estate in Greenwich. Could be important for business, you understand. He smiled, but it was not directed at me. It was for the benefit of whoever might be watching, a performance of confidence and power, a demonstration that he had found something better and I was no longer necessary. Vanessa laughed. The sound was crystalline and cruel. I'm sure you can manage, Catherine. You're very capable with practical matters. Her hand was already on Edward's arm in a gesture of possession rather than casual touch. They turned and walked away together toward the parking lot exit. Edward did not look back. Not once. The parking lot suddenly felt enormous and empty despite being filled with expensive vehicles. I stood there holding his car keys, watching my husband of 15 years climb into another woman's custom Range Rover without a backward glance, and felt something fundamental break inside me. Not loudly or dramatically, but quietly, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Invisible until you are already falling through. I drove Edward's car home through empty suburban streets at midnight, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The dashboard lights cast harsh shadows across my face in the rearview mirror, and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked harder, older, more dangerous than the person who had gotten dressed for a party just hours earlier. The rage was there, hot and immediate, burning in my chest like I had swallowed something caustic. But underneath it, something colder was already forming. Something analytical and precise. The part of my brain that solves problems was beginning to wake up, sorting through what had just happened and cataloging it like evidence in a case file. Because that is what this had become. Case. My marriage was no longer a relationship to be saved but a fraud to be investigated and documented. The house was completely dark when I pulled into the driveway. Silent in a way that felt deliberate rather than peaceful. I sat in the car for a full minute before I could make myself go inside, staring at the white picket fence Edward had insisted we install 5 years ago because successful people have white picket fences. The hydrangeas I had planted and fertilized and watered with careful precision. The exterior paint I had selected from dozens of samples to achieve exactly the right shade of welcoming warmth. All of it suddenly looked like a set. A carefully constructed stage designed to project an image that had nothing to do with the reality rotting inside. When I finally went inside, the emptiness hit me immediately. Olivia and James were spending the weekend with my parents. I had arranged this myself 2 weeks ago, thinking it would be nice for the children to have special time with their grandparents while Edward and I attended his work event. Now the timing felt suspiciously convenient. Edward had known the children would be absent tonight. He had known when he made his plans with Vanessa that our daughter and son would not be home to witness my return alone and humiliated. The calculation of it sent fresh waves of rage through my body. This was not some spontaneous mistake, some moment of weakness he could later claim to regret. This was deliberate, methodical, a performance staged for maximum impact with minimum consequence to his comfort. Edward had planned this. He had orchestrated my public humiliation with the same attention to detail he applied to closing high-commission sales. And that realization changed something fundamental in how I understood the man I had been married to for 15 years. I went to my home office and turned on every light. I made coffee strong enough to strip paint. And then I did what I do best. I started investigating. Edward and I maintained joint accounts for household expenses. This was standard financial practice for married couples, and I had never questioned it because I had trusted him. That trust, I now recognized with bitter clarity, had been catastrophically misplaced. But we also had personal accounts. Edward had his own checking account tied to his commission income from Meridian, and I had mine from my consulting practice revenue. I had never examined his personal accounts closely, operating under the assumption that his income covered his professional wardrobe and client entertainment expenses and that how he managed those funds was his own business as long as he contributed his share to our household budget. That assumption had been a mistake. I started with our joint credit card statements, downloading 3 years of transaction history and building spreadsheets that categorized every charge by merchant, date, and amount. This is work I do for clients routinely, identifying spending patterns and tracking where money actually goes versus where it is supposed to go. The process is methodical and requires patience, but patterns emerge quickly for someone trained to see them. The first pattern appeared within 20 minutes. Regular charges at the Brookfield Inn, appearing every Friday afternoon over the past 8 months. Always for the same amount. $275. I pulled up the hotel's website and checked their room rates. Premium suite. Friday afternoon check-in. The timing and amount matched exactly. Every Friday for 8 months, Edward had been renting a hotel room. While I thought he was working late or meeting clients or doing whatever he claimed was keeping him at the dealership past normal business hours, he had actually been 20 minutes away in a hotel suite that cost $275 for a few hours of privacy. I added up the charges. 8 months. Approximately 32 weeks. Nearly $9,000 spent on hotel rooms. But that was just the beginning. As I continued building my spreadsheet, more patterns emerged. Expensive restaurant charges on evenings when Edward claimed to be working late. Places I had never been to, meals I had never shared. Multiple purchases at jewelry stores. I cross-referenced the dates with my own calendar and confirmed that I had received no gifts on any of those dates. No birthday presents. No anniversary gifts. No random tokens of affection. Edward had been buying jewelry for someone else using our joint credit card. Using money from the account I contributed to from my consulting practice earnings. Money that should have been designated for household expenses or saving for our children's futures. Then I found the charge from La Maison Boutique. $4,000. 3 weeks ago. I looked up the store. Exclusive women's clothing. High-end designer pieces. Custom tailoring available. I thought about the dress Vanessa had been wearing tonight, how perfectly it had fit her body, how clearly expensive it had been. Edward had bought his mistress a $4,000 dress using our joint credit card. The rage that surged through me in that moment was almost physical, like something with weight and heat pressing against my ribcage. But I forced myself to stay focused. To keep documenting. To build the case. Because that is what this was now. A case against my husband for fraud and theft and systematic betrayal that went far beyond simple infidelity. I pulled up Edward's personal checking account next. He kept his login credentials in his desk drawer, written on a sticky note tucked inside an old planner he no longer used. Edward was not sophisticated about digital security, apparently believing that his affairs, both romantic and financial, were too unimportant for anyone to bother investigating. That was another mistake. The checking account revealed monthly transfers to something called VW Holdings LLC. $5,000 per month for the past 7 months. $35,000 total. VW Holdings. The initials clicked immediately. Vanessa Whitmore Holdings. Edward had been making direct payments to a company controlled by his mistress. Regular monthly transfers that looked like legitimate business expenses but were clearly something else entirely. I spent the next 2 hours diving into corporate registrations and business filings, tracking down every piece of publicly available information about VW Holdings LLC. The company was registered in Connecticut as a business consulting firm. Principal officer listed as Vanessa Whitmore. Business purpose stated as providing strategic advisory services to automotive sales professionals seeking to expand their client base among high-net-worth individuals. The description was perfect. Vague enough to sound legitimate. Specific enough to justify why an automotive sales director might be paying for such services. It was a cover story designed to disguise payments that had nothing to do with business consulting and everything to do with paying for access to a woman who had turned her affairs into a profitable enterprise. Vanessa had monetized her relationship with Edward. She had set up a shell company specifically designed to collect payments from him while providing the appearance of legitimate business transactions. And Edward had been sufficiently besotted, or perhaps sufficiently desperate to maintain access to her wealth and social connections, that he had willingly bankrupted our household finances to fund this arrangement. The professional quality of the con was almost impressive. If it had not been destroying my family, I might have admired the sophistication of it. But I was not finished investigating. I pulled our savings account statements next, and what I found made my hands start shaking again. The account I had been steadily contributing to for the past 8 years, carefully building a financial cushion for emergencies and our children's future education, had been systematically drained. Edward had been making withdrawals. Large ones. 5,000 here. 7,000 there. 10,000 in a single transaction just last month. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with the transfers to VW Holdings. They matched perfectly. Edward had been pulling money from our family savings to make his monthly payments to Vanessa's company. Our children's college fund. The money I had sacrificed and saved and carefully invested. Gone. transferred to a shell company owned by a woman who viewed my husband as nothing more than a mark in an elaborate financial scam. But the discovery that made my blood run cold came when I found the mortgage documents in our filing cabinet. I had been looking for our original mortgage paperwork to verify something, and I found a second set of documents I had never seen before. A home equity line of credit. $25,000 borrowed against our home 6 months ago. This type of borrowing requires spousal consent. Both names on the property title must sign. I looked at the signature page and saw my name written in handwriting that was close to mine but not quite right. I pulled out other documents with my actual signature. Tax returns. Legal papers from my business incorporation. The deed to our house from when we first purchased it 15 years ago. I laid them side by side and compared. The forgery was obvious once I knew to look for it. The signature on the mortgage documents was slightly too large. The loop on the capital C was wrong. The slant did not quite match my natural handwriting. Someone had practiced writing my name and had gotten close enough to fool a loan officer who had no reason to question it, but not close enough to fool me when I looked carefully. Edward had forged my signature on legal documents to take out a loan against our home without my knowledge or consent. That was not just betrayal. That was fraud. Criminal fraud that could have legal consequences beyond divorce proceedings. I sat back in my office chair and stared at the documents spread across my desk. Bank statements, credit card records, corporate filings, mortgage papers. Together they told a comprehensive story of systematic financial betrayal spanning at least 18 months, possibly longer. Edward had transferred approximately $180,000 to his mistress and her shell company. He had drained our savings account. He had liquidated investments designated for our children's education. He had taken out an illegal second mortgage on our home using forged documents. And he had done all of this while maintaining the fiction that he was the primary breadwinner, while minimizing my contributions to our household, while introducing me as someone who does bookkeeping rather than someone who runs a successful financial consulting practice. The sky was starting to lighten outside my office window. I had been awake all night building spreadsheets and tracking money trails and assembling evidence. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. My eyes burned from staring at computer screens and printed documents. But I had what I needed. A complete financial picture of Edward's betrayal. Documentation that could not be disputed or explained away. Evidence that would stand up in court when I filed for divorce and demanded accountability for what he had done. Edward had thrown his car keys at my chest and told me to find my own way home. He had walked away with another woman without a backward glance, confident that I would accept this humiliation and quietly disappear from his life without causing problems. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation, because I had found my way home. And now I was going to systematically dismantle everything he thought he had built with Vanessa Whitmore, using his own documented crimes as weapons against him. At 7 in the morning my phone rang. I had not slept. I was still sitting at my desk surrounded by printed bank statements and spreadsheets, my eyes burning from hours of staring at financial documents, my coffee long since gone cold. The caller ID showed Edward's number. I let it ring 3 times before answering, forcing myself to take slow breaths and compose my voice into something that sounded calm, neutral. As though I had not just spent the entire night documenting his systematic theft from our family. Catherine, I need you to transfer $50,000 from your business account to my personal checking today, Edward said without preamble. No greeting. No apology for throwing car keys at my chest in a parking lot full of witnesses. No acknowledgement that he had abandoned me at a public event and spent the night with another woman. Just a demand for money, delivered as though requesting this amount was equivalent to asking me to pick up groceries. It's urgent, he continued when I did not respond immediately. Business opportunity that can't wait. The audacity of it was so staggering that I almost laughed. After everything he had done, after the public humiliation and the private betrayal, after draining our savings and forging my signature on mortgage documents, he was calling to demand more money from the business account I had built through my own work. Money that had nothing to do with him or his income or his life at Meridian Imports. What business opportunity? I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral despite the rage burning in my chest. Vanessa's offering to invest in a luxury vehicle leasing venture I'm starting, Edward said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. The belief that he was on the verge of something important. But I need capital to demonstrate commitment. She's putting in 500,000. I need to match 10% to secure the partnership. He was scamming him. Still scamming him even now after he had already given her nearly $200,000. Vanessa had no intention of investing anything. This was the final extraction, the last withdrawal before she disappeared entirely and moved on to her next target. The realization crystallized with perfect clarity. Edward was not just a cheating husband. He was a mark in a sophisticated con operation, too blinded by infatuation and desperation to recognize that he was being played. I'll need to review the business plan and partnership documents before transferring that amount, I said, maintaining my professional tone. Send them to me and I'll make my decision. There's no time for your analysis, Catherine, Edward said, and I could hear irritation creeping into his voice. This is opportunity knocking. Either you're with me or you're in my way. I see, I said quietly. I'll make my decision soon. I hung up before he could respond and immediately pulled up the contact information for David Martinez. David was an attorney who specialized in marital fraud and asset protection. He had been a client of mine 2 years earlier when his small practice faced financial difficulties that threatened to destroy everything he had built. I had analyzed his books, identified where money was being wasted, restructured his billing practices, and helped him implement systems that turned his struggling firm into a profitable operation. He had told me at the time that if I ever needed legal help he would return the favor. I called his cell phone at 7:15 in the morning. He answered on the third ring, his voice still rough with sleep. David Martinez. David, this is Catherine Brennan. I need help. My husband has been systematically stealing from our family to fund an affair, and I need someone who specializes in marital fraud. There was a brief pause and then his voice sharpened with focus. Tell me everything. I spent 20 minutes walking him through what I had discovered. The hotel charges. The jewelry purchases. The transfers to VW Holdings. The drained savings account. The forged mortgage documents. David listened without interrupting and I could hear him typing notes as I spoke. Catherine, he said when I finished, your husband just handed you a nuclear weapon. Let me make some calls. He hung up, and I sat back in my chair feeling something that might have been hope beginning to compete with the rage that had been fueling me through the long night. David called back 3 hours later. I've got someone you need to meet. Andrea Thornhill. She's a forensic accountant, the best in Connecticut for uncovering hidden assets and financial fraud. She's agreed to look at your case as a favor to me. Can you meet at your house in an hour? Andrea Thornhill arrived at noon carrying a leather briefcase and an iPad. She was in her early 40s, professionally dressed, with sharp eyes that immediately began cataloging details about my home and my demeanor. David had come with her, and they sat together at my kitchen table while I laid out all the documentation I had assembled. Andrea worked in silence for nearly an hour, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions about specific transactions. David watched her with the expression of someone who has seen this process before and knows to wait patiently for the expert analysis. Finally, Andrea looked up from the documents spread across my table. Her expression had shifted from professional interest to something approaching genuine outrage. This is one of the most comprehensive patterns of marital financial fraud I've encountered in 15 years of practice, she said. Your husband has systematically depleted marital assets, committed forgery to obtain illegal loans, and transferred substantial sums to what appears to be a shell company. Any one of these actions would be sufficient grounds for favorable divorce terms. Together, they represent potential criminal fraud. She paused, tapping one finger against a printout of the VW Holdings corporate registration. But there's something else here, Andrea continued. These payments to VW Holdings. The amounts, the regularity, the business consulting cover story. I've seen this exact pattern before. Twice, actually, in cases I worked over the past 2 years. Different victims but the same company name. The same principal officer listed. Vanessa Whitmore, I said. Yes. I think your husband's mistress is running a serial con operation targeting married men with disposable income. And if that's true, there will be other victims. Other men making payments to the same shell company under the same false pretenses. Andrea opened her iPad and began searching through databases I did not have access to, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. David and I watched in silence as she worked. Here, Andrea said after several minutes. VW Holdings LLC has received payments from multiple sources over the past 2 years. I can see at least 3 other individuals making regular transfers. All of them connected to Meridian Luxury Imports based on the account information I can access. She looked up at me with an expression that was part sympathy and part professional excitement at uncovering a complex fraud scheme. Your husband is not special to Vanessa Whitmore. He's one of several marks she's been running this scam on simultaneously. She targets middle-aged men in high-commission sales roles. Men with access to significant income but without the generational wealth she possesses. Men who are susceptible to flattery from someone they perceive as unattainable. She initiates affairs, gradually introduces investment opportunities that require capital contributions, and extracts maximum value before disappearing. Andrea turned her iPad so I could see the screen showing corporate tax filings for VW Holdings. But here's the critical mistake she made. VW Holdings has been generating substantial revenue without filing appropriate tax returns. She's not declaring these payments as income. That's tax evasion, and the amounts involved are significant enough to trigger serious IRS penalties. She pulled up a calculator and started running numbers. Based on what I can see, Vanessa Whitmore owes approximately $250,000 in back taxes on unreported income, not including penalties and interest that will likely double that amount. And the evidence is thoroughly documented in bank records and corporate filings. David leaned forward. Can we use this? Absolutely, Andrea said. We file for divorce with comprehensive financial exhibits. But we also file a civil fraud lawsuit against Vanessa Whitmore and VW Holdings, naming Edward as a co-plaintiff despite his involvement. We argue that he was a victim of deliberate financial fraud. And we forward all documentation to the IRS showing unreported income from her shell company. She looked at me directly. Catherine, we can potentially recover a substantial portion of the money your husband transferred. We can demonstrate to the divorce court that you are pursuing legitimate legal remedies rather than acting vindicatively. And we can ensure that Vanessa Whitmore faces consequences for running a systematic fraud operation. How long will this take? I asked. I'll need 48 hours to complete my investigation and compile a comprehensive report, Andrea said. David can file the legal paperwork by Monday morning. David nodded. The divorce filing will include detailed financial exhibits documenting Edward's fraudulent mortgage, unauthorized depletion of marital assets, and payments to Vanessa's company. The civil fraud lawsuit will demand full return of all transferred funds plus damages. And the IRS documentation will trigger an audit that will scrutinize Vanessa's entire financial structure. He paused, meeting my eyes. Once we set this in motion, there's no going back. Your husband will know you've discovered everything. Vanessa will know she's been exposed. This will get ugly. It's already ugly, I said. They made it ugly when they threw car keys at me in a parking lot and drove away together. I'm just documenting the ugliness they created. Andrea began packing up her materials. I'll have the report to David by Sunday evening. He'll file everything Monday morning. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen and felt something shift inside me. The rage was still there, hot and immediate. But underneath it, something colder and more focused had taken root. Edward and Vanessa had underestimated me. They had assumed I would accept humiliation quietly and disappear without causing problems. They were about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Monday morning, David filed the paperwork. Divorce petition with comprehensive financial exhibits. Civil fraud lawsuit against Vanessa Whitmore and VW Holdings. Documentation forwarded to the IRS showing systematic underreporting of income. Everything I had assembled over that long sleepless night, now transformed into legal action that could not be undone or ignored. I spent Monday working from home trying to focus on client projects but finding my attention repeatedly drawn back to my phone. Waiting for the inevitable response. Knowing that Edward would receive notification of the divorce filing within hours. Knowing that Vanessa would be contacted by her attorney about the fraud lawsuit. Knowing that everything I had set in motion would trigger consequences I could anticipate but not fully control. Tuesday morning arrived with Edward's phone call at 6. I was already awake, drinking coffee in my kitchen and watching dawn break over the white picket fence that suddenly seemed like the most pathetic symbol of false security imaginable. Catherine. His voice was high and tight with panic. Vanessa's attorney contacted me. She's threatening to sue me for defamation and harassment. She says I misrepresented our business relationship and she's terminating our consulting agreement immediately. I need those documents showing the payments were legitimate business expenses. I need proof that VW Holdings was actually providing consulting services. I took a slow sip of coffee before responding, letting the silence stretch between us. There are no documents showing that, Edward. Because it was not a legitimate business relationship. She was scamming you. What are you talking about? The panic in his voice was escalating toward something that might have been hysteria. Of course it was legitimate. Vanessa was helping me develop relationships with high-net-worth clients. That's what the consulting agreement covered. VW Holdings is not a consulting firm, I said, keeping my voice calm and factual. It's a shell company Vanessa uses to collect payments from multiple men she's running the same operation on. You've been paying for access to her, disguised as business consulting. And she's been failing to report that income to the IRS. I filed for divorce yesterday and included civil fraud charges against both her company and her personally. The IRS received copies of all documentation this morning. The silence that followed was so profound I thought he might have hung up. Then I heard his breathing, rapid and shallow, the sound of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. You did what? His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Catherine, you can't just, she'll destroy me. Her family has connections everywhere. They'll ruin whatever's left of my career. Your career? I asked, and I could not keep the edge from my voice. You threw car keys at my chest in a parking lot full of your colleagues and told me to find my own way home while you left with your mistress. You drained our children's college funds to pay a woman who was treating you like a client. You forged my signature on mortgage documents. And you're worried about your career? Before he could respond, my phone buzzed with another incoming call. Margaret Ashford. The woman who had looked at me with sympathy at the gala while her husband quickly guided her away from my public humiliation. Edward, I have another call, I said and disconnected without waiting for his reply. Catherine, this is Margaret Ashford. We met briefly on Saturday evening. I remember. Thank you for calling. I'm calling because my husband Thomas just informed me that Meridian Imports terminated Edward's employment this morning. Margaret's voice was careful, as though she was choosing each word deliberately. Apparently someone sent the dealership ownership detailed documentation of Edward's relationship with a client, including evidence that he was accepting payments from that client in exchange for providing her with confidential information about other dealership customers' financial situations and purchase patterns. That's grounds for immediate termination under his employment contract. I had not sent that information to Meridian, which meant someone else had. Someone who knew about Edward's relationship with Vanessa and had been waiting for the right moment to act. I appreciate you letting me know, I said. Catherine, there's something else. Margaret paused, and I could hear her taking a breath as though preparing to share something difficult. Vanessa Whitmore contacted my husband this morning in a complete panic. Apparently her family's attorneys have informed her that the IRS documentation you filed has triggered an audit not just of VW Holdings but of Whitmore Development Corporation's entire financial structure. Her father is reportedly furious. He's cut off her access to family funds until the situation is resolved. The Whitmore family is very protective of their reputation and very concerned about their own tax exposure. The information settled over me with a weight that felt almost physical. Vanessa's wealthy family, the source of her confidence and her sense of invulnerability, had abandoned her, cut her off financially, left her to face the consequences of her fraud operation alone. She's asking Thomas if he knows any way to make the lawsuit go away, Margaret continued. She's offering to return some of the money if you'll agree to drop the charges and the IRS notification. My husband told her he couldn't help with that and suggested she speak with her attorney. Thank you for telling me this, Margaret. Catherine, you should also know that several of us wives have been comparing notes since Saturday evening. Vanessa's done this before to other families. What you're doing by pursuing legal action is protecting people who might otherwise become her next victims. Don't let anyone tell you this is vindictive or excessive. It's appropriate accountability for documented fraud. After Margaret hung up, I sat in my kitchen holding my cooling coffee and feeling something that might have been vindication beginning to compete with the exhaustion that had been accumulating since Saturday night. Wednesday evening, Edward appeared at our home. I watched through the window as he parked his car in the driveway and sat there for several minutes before finally getting out and walking to the front door. When I opened it, I barely recognized the man standing on my porch. He had aged visibly in just 4 days. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he had not been sleeping. His clothes were wrinkled and mismatched, his hair uncombed, his usual meticulous grooming completely abandoned. His characteristic confidence had been replaced by something that looked like desperation mixed with genuine fear. "Catherine, please. We need to talk about this reasonably. I made mistakes, but filing lawsuits and involving the IRS is vindictive. Think about the children." I stepped aside and let him in, but I did not invite him to sit. We stood in the entryway like strangers rather than people who had shared a home for 15 years. "I am thinking about the children, Edward. I'm thinking about how you liquidated their college fund to pay your mistress. I'm thinking about how you put our home at risk with an illegal second mortgage. I'm thinking about how you publicly humiliated their mother in front of your colleagues. Everything I'm doing now is protecting them from the consequences of your choices." Vanessa said this was all a misunderstanding. She claims the payments were legitimate consulting fees for business development advice. I walked to the kitchen and retrieved the folder of documentation Andrea had assembled. I laid it out on the dining room table where Edward could see it. Bank statements showing payments to VW Holdings. Corporate filings proving it was a shell company. Email records Andrea had obtained through legal discovery showing communications with 3 other men who had paid Vanessa under identical circumstances. "James Morrison from your finance department," I said, pointing to one set of documents. "Kevin Chong from Fleet Sales. Robert Sullivan, who retired last year. All of them made payments to VW Holdings LLC. All of them had affairs with Vanessa. All of them thought they were investing in business opportunities that never materialized. You weren't special, Edward. You were just the latest mark in a pattern she's been running for years." He stared at the documents, his hands trembling as he picked up pages and set them down again. "She told me I was different. That we had something real." "She told you that because it was effective," I said. "You wanted to believe you had captured the attention of someone wealthy and beautiful, so you ignored every warning sign that you were being exploited. You wanted access to her world badly enough that you bankrupted our family to pay for it." Edward looked up at me, and for the first time I saw genuine recognition in his eyes. Not remorse exactly, he was not self-aware enough for genuine remorse, but at least acknowledgement that he had been thoroughly deceived. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now you move out of this house. You cooperate fully with the divorce proceedings. You find new employment. And you hope the judge shows mercy when determining child support, because based on current income calculations, you're going to struggle to make those payments. Where am I supposed to go? I genuinely do not care, Edward. Perhaps you should call Vanessa and ask if her Greenwich estate has a spare room. Though I suspect she's not taking your calls anymore." He left that evening with 2 suitcases, loading them into his car while I watched from the window. The same car I had driven home Saturday night. The keys he had thrown at me still sat in my desk drawer, kept as evidence for the divorce proceedings. After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen and realized I could no longer protect our children from the truth. Olivia and James deserved to know why their father had moved out, why their lives were about to change dramatically. They deserved honesty rather than comfortable lies that would eventually unravel anyway. I called my parents and asked them to bring the children home the following morning. When Olivia and James walked through the door Thursday morning, I saw immediately that Olivia had already guessed most of what had happened. Her expression was guarded, protective of her younger brother who looked confused about being brought home early. I sat them both down at the kitchen table. "Your father and I are getting divorced. He made choices that broke trust in our marriage. He was spending time and money on someone else instead of our family. I know this is hard and I'm sorry you have to go through this." James cried. Olivia reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said, "for not pretending anymore." The 6 weeks between Edward moving out and our court date passed in a strange blur of activity and waiting. I worked with David and Andrea to refine our documentation, adding layers of evidence that made Edward's fraud increasingly impossible to dispute. I met with my children's school counselors to explain the family situation and ensure Olivia and James had support systems beyond what I could provide alone. I continued working with my consulting clients, finding that the analytical work helped ground me when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. The story had leaked to local media. Not through me but through channels I could not control once court filings became public record. A reporter from the Connecticut Post called me 3 times asking for comment on what they were calling the luxury car love triangle fraud case. I declined to speak with them. My silence did not stop the coverage. The narrative was too compelling. A wealthy socialite running a systematic con operation on multiple married men. A shell company disguised as business consulting. Nearly $1 million in unreported income. Federal prosecutors reportedly considering wire fraud charges. Edward's life had collapsed with remarkable speed. Terminated from Meridian Imports. Unable to find comparable employment in the luxury automotive industry because word traveled fast in that insular community. Living in a studio apartment 40 minutes away that he could barely afford on unemployment benefits. Vanessa had stopped returning his calls the moment her attorney contacted her about the fraud lawsuit. The business opportunity Edward had been so excited about, the one he had demanded $50,000 from my business account to invest in, had evaporated completely. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. The courthouse was smaller than I had anticipated, less imposing than the courtrooms shown on television but no less consequential. The building itself was old, built in an era when government architecture was meant to project stability and permanence rather than modern efficiency. High ceilings. Wooden benches worn smooth by generations of people waiting for their cases to be called. The smell of old paper and floor polish and the anxious sweat of people whose lives were being decided by judges they had never met. Judge Marianne Sheffield presided over family court matters in this district. David had briefed me extensively on her background and reputation. 58 years old. On the bench for 19 years. Former prosecutor who had handled financial crimes before being appointed to the judiciary. Known for having zero tolerance for any form of financial fraud within marriages. David said she had never once, in nearly 2 decades of presiding over divorce cases, awarded favorable terms to a spouse who had committed documented financial betrayal. Her rulings were thorough, well-reasoned, and consistently upheld on appeal because she was meticulous about following legal procedure while delivering justice that felt appropriate to the circumstances. Edward sat at the defendant's table with a public defender who looked barely old enough to have graduated law school. Edward could no longer afford private representation. The young attorney kept glancing at the thick folders of documentation David had submitted to the court, and I could see in his expression that he knew his client was indefensible. He was here because the system required Edward to have legal representation, not because there was any realistic argument to be made in Edward's favor. Judge Sheffield entered and we all stood. She was exactly as David had described. Steel gray hair cut in a practical style that required minimal maintenance. No jewelry except for simple earrings and a watch. Reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. The expression of someone who had heard every excuse and lie and desperate rationalization that people could produce when their marriages fell apart and found none of them particularly novel or compelling. "Please be seated," she said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that made you want to sit up straighter and pay attention. "We are here for the divorce proceedings of Brennan versus Brennan. I have reviewed all submitted documentation. Counsel, you may proceed." Edward's public defender stood and made his argument. He claimed Edward had been a victim of manipulation by a sophisticated con artist. That Edward had already suffered significant consequences including job loss and public humiliation. That the court should show compassion for a man who had been deceived and avoid punishing him further by stripping him of marital assets. That Edward deserved the opportunity to rebuild his life without being financially destroyed by divorce terms that seemed vindictive rather than fair. Judge Sheffield listened without interrupting. Her expression revealed nothing. When the public defender finished and sat down, she turned to David. "Mr. Martinez, your response." David stood and approached the bench with the calm confidence of someone who knew he held every advantage. He provided Judge Sheffield with the comprehensive documentation Andrea had assembled. Complete financial records showing systematic depletion of marital assets over 18 months. Bank statements proving Edward had drained savings accounts and liquidated investment funds without my knowledge or consent. The fraudulent second mortgage with forged signatures that Andrea's analysis had proven were not authentic. Records of payments to VW Holdings totaling nearly $200,000. Evidence that I had been the family's primary source of stable income throughout our marriage while Edward's commission-based earnings fluctuated wildly based on market conditions and his personal sales performance. David also presented written testimony from Margaret Ashford and 2 other women whose husbands had been targeted by Vanessa Whitmore. Their statements described identical patterns of behavior. Affairs that began with flattery and attention from a woman who seemed impossibly out of reach. Gradual introductions of investment opportunities that required substantial capital contributions. Promises of business partnerships and access to wealthy social circles. And eventually, the revelation that they had been systematically deceived and financially exploited. Your Honor, David concluded, Mr. Brennan did not simply commit infidelity, which would itself constitute grounds for favorable divorce terms for my client. He systematically defrauded his own family by liquidating assets without spousal consent, forging legal documents to obtain loans against property he did not solely own, and prioritizing payments to his mistress over his children's welfare and education. He threw car keys at his wife's chest in a parking lot full of witnesses and told her to find her own way home while he left with another woman. He publicly humiliated the mother of his children. And he did all of this while positioning himself as the family breadwinner despite the documented evidence that Mrs. Brennan's consulting income provided the stable financial foundation that supported their household throughout their marriage. Judge Sheffield had been reading through the documentation while David spoke. Now she looked up, removed her reading glasses, and fixed Edward with a stare that could have frozen water. Mr. Brennan, I have been on this bench for 19 years. In that time, I have presided over hundreds of divorce cases involving infidelity, financial disputes, and contested custody arrangements. I have seen marriages destroyed by addiction, by abuse, by fundamental incompatibility, and by simple neglect accumulated over years of failing to maintain partnership. But I have rarely encountered such comprehensive and deliberate financial betrayal within a marriage as what is documented in the evidence before me. She paused and I watched Edward physically shrink in his chair. His shoulders curved inward. His head dropped slightly. He looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. You did not simply have an affair, Judge Sheffield continued. You destroyed your family's financial security to fund that affair. You forged your wife's signature on mortgage documents, which is not merely grounds for divorce but constitutes potential criminal fraud that could result in prosecution if Mrs. Brennan chose to pursue that option. You liquidated your children's education funds without consent or discussion. You systematically drained savings accounts that your wife had contributed to and built through her own professional labor. And you did all of this while maintaining the fiction that you were the primary financial provider for your household, when the documented evidence shows that Mrs. Brennan's consulting practice provided consistent and stable income while your commission-based earnings fluctuated significantly. Judge Sheffield put her reading glasses back on and looked down at her notes. The court awards Mrs. Catherine Brennan full ownership of the marital home, with Mr. Brennan's name to be removed from all property documents and title transferred solely to Mrs. Brennan. All remaining marital assets, including vehicles currently titled in either spouse's name and all investment accounts, are awarded to Mrs. Brennan. Mr. Brennan will be responsible for repaying the fraudulent second mortgage in full through a payment plan to be established with the lending institution. Child support is set at 30% of Mr. Brennan's gross monthly income, to be paid directly to Mrs. Brennan on the first of each month. Mrs. Brennan is awarded full legal custody of both minor children, with Mr. Brennan receiving supervised visitation rights pending successful completion of family counseling to be arranged through the court's Family Services Department. Edward's attorney started to stand, perhaps to object, but Judge Sheffield held up one hand. I am not finished. Mr. Brennan, you are extraordinarily fortunate that this court lacks jurisdiction to order you to repay the funds you transferred to Ms. Whitmore's company, as that matter is subject to separate civil proceedings currently underway. You are also fortunate that Mrs. Brennan has not filed criminal charges regarding the forged signatures on mortgage documents, though I note for the record that this option remains available to her should she choose to pursue it in the future. This court is adjourned. We walked out into October sunshine that felt almost too bright after the dim courtroom. David was already talking about next steps in the civil case against Vanessa, explaining that her attorney had been making overtures about potential settlement to avoid the publicity of a trial. My parents were waiting outside with Olivia and James, standing slightly apart from the small crowd of people waiting for other cases to be called. The moment my children saw me, they ran. James reached me first, crashing into me with the full force of an 11-year-old who had been worried about his mother. Olivia was more measured but no less urgent, wrapping her arms around both of us. "Is it over?" Olivia asked, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "It's over," I said. "And we're going to be okay." James pulled back slightly to look at my face. "I'm glad we don't have to pretend anymore." I realized in that moment that my children had understood far more than I had given them credit for. They had been watching their parents' marriage slowly disintegrate. They had sensed the tension and dishonesty even when I thought I was hiding it successfully. And they had been waiting for someone to finally acknowledge the truth they already knew. 2 weeks after walking out of that courthouse with my children, my phone rang with a call from a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I had been fielding calls from reporters and curious acquaintances since the divorce became public, and I had learned to screen carefully. But something made me answer. "Mrs. Brennan? My name is Linda Foster. I got your number from Margaret Ashford. I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I need help and Margaret said you might understand my situation better than anyone else." Her voice carried a tremor that I recognized immediately. The sound of someone whose world had just collapsed and who was trying desperately to hold herself together long enough to ask for help. "Tell me what's happening," I said. Over the next 40 minutes, Linda described a situation that felt uncomfortably familiar. A husband who traveled frequently for work. Credit card charges that did not make sense. Money disappearing from their savings account with explanations that became increasingly vague. A business investment he claimed would transform their financial future but required immediate capital she was supposed to trust him about without asking too many questions. "Margaret told me what you did," Linda said. "How you investigated your husband's finances and found evidence of fraud. I need someone who can do that for me. I need someone who understands what I'm going through and won't tell me I'm being paranoid or controlling." I spent 3 days analyzing Linda's financial records. What I found was not identical to Edward's betrayal but followed similar patterns. Her husband had been funding an online gambling addiction for 7 years, taking out loans in her name without her knowledge, forging her signature on credit applications, and systematically draining their retirement accounts to cover losses that totaled nearly $80,000. Linda filed for divorce the following week, armed with documentation that made her husband's fraud impossible to dispute. She was not the only one who called. Within a month of the divorce hearing, I received inquiries from 3 other women, all of them referred by someone who knew someone who had heard about my case. Their situations varied. One woman's husband had been conducting an online relationship with someone he had never met in person, sending money for supposed emergencies that never seemed to end. Another had discovered her husband maintained a second family in a different state, supported entirely by funds he had diverted from their joint accounts. I helped all of them. I analyzed their financial records with the same ruthless precision I had applied to my own situation. I identified hidden accounts and fraudulent transfers and patterns of deception their husbands thought were too sophisticated to be discovered. I connected them with attorneys who understood marital fraud. I provided expert testimony when their cases went to court. The work was different from my corporate consulting practice. More personal. More emotionally intense. The clients were not faceless businesses but women whose lives had been systematically undermined by people they had trusted completely. But the work was also deeply satisfying in ways my previous projects had never been. I could see the direct impact of what I was doing. I could watch women who had been financially devastated begin to rebuild security and confidence. By the end of the year, I had consulted on 8 divorce cases involving financial fraud. My practice was evolving into something I had never anticipated but that clearly served a need that existing resources were not adequately addressing. The civil case against Vanessa Whitmore resolved through settlement 3 months after the divorce hearing. Her attorney had been pushing for resolution to avoid the publicity of a trial, and David had been willing to negotiate because settlement meant guaranteed recovery rather than the uncertainty of litigation. The terms were comprehensive. Vanessa would repay all funds Edward had transferred to VW Holdings, plus damages, plus our legal fees. The total came to $220,000, to be paid in installments over 5 years with significant penalties if she missed any payment. The settlement also required her to dissolve VW Holdings completely and permanently, ensuring she could not simply restart the same operation under a different name. But Vanessa faced consequences that extended far beyond what our lawsuit could impose. The IRS assessment totaled $340,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. Federal prosecutors had filed wire fraud charges based on interstate financial transfers, and Vanessa had ultimately accepted a plea agreement involving substantial restitution payments and 3 years of probation. Her family had cut off all contact. Margaret told me through her network of social connections that the Whitmore family was reportedly ashamed by the scandal and deeply concerned about protecting their business reputation from association with Vanessa's criminal behavior. They had retained crisis management consultants to distance Whitmore Development Corporation from any connection to VW Holdings or the fraud investigation. Vanessa had moved to California according to the last information I received. She was working in commercial real estate. Her days of targeting vulnerable married men apparently concluded. Though I suspected that someone with her skills and her willingness to exploit others would eventually find new opportunities for deception in new locations. Edward's life had diminished in ways that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. He found work selling mid-range vehicles at a dealership that catered to families buying practical cars rather than wealthy clients purchasing luxury status symbols. His income was a fraction of what he had earned at Meridian. His monthly child support payments consumed most of what remained, leaving him with barely enough to cover rent on a studio apartment in a neighborhood where his car had been broken into twice in the first month. He showed up for his scheduled supervised visitations with Olivia and James, but the visits were strained and awkward. Olivia had gone through a phase of refusing to see him at all, her anger manifesting as complete rejection that I suspected hurt her as much as it hurt him. I never forced her to attend the visits when she adamantly refused, believing that rebuilding trust required her willingness rather than my insistence. James was more willing to maintain contact but had become emotionally guarded in ways that broke my heart. He treated the visits like obligations rather than opportunities for genuine connection. When Edward tried to explain that he had been deceived, that Vanessa had manipulated him, James would listen politely and then change the subject to something neutral like school or sports. Edward occasionally attempted to justify his actions during pick-up and drop-off exchanges, explaining to me that he had been as much a victim as anyone. I would listen without responding, understanding that he needed to construct a narrative where he was not entirely culpable for the destruction of his family. But I never validated that narrative. Being fooled by a sophisticated con artist does not excuse stealing from your own children's education funds or forging your wife's signature on legal documents. 6 months after the divorce finalized, Margaret Ashford called with information that surprised me. "Catherine, my husband Thomas has been referring his colleagues to your practice. He's been telling everyone about how you uncovered Vanessa's entire operation. He's framing it as legitimate financial investigation that protected other potential victims rather than personal revenge." "That's unexpectedly generous of him," I said. Thomas was uncomfortable with what happened at the gala. He saw how Edward treated you in that parking lot and felt guilty that nobody intervened. This is his way of making amends, I think. Several of his colleagues have wives who need financial consulting for various situations. He's been specifically recommending you as someone who is both thorough and discreet. Margaret organized informal gatherings with other wives from the automotive dealership community. These were not pity meetings or awkward social obligations but genuine connections with women who understood the particular vulnerabilities that came with being married to men in high-pressure sales environments where appearance and status often mattered more than substance. At one of these gatherings, a woman named Patricia confided that her husband had been targeted by Vanessa years earlier. He had ended the relationship before any financial damage occurred, but Patricia had suspected there was a pattern of behavior that extended beyond just her husband. She had been waiting for someone to expose what she believed was systematic fraud. Another woman, whose name was Susan, shared that she had begun conducting her own quiet financial audit of her marriage after witnessing what happened to me. She had discovered that her husband had been hiding significant debt from failed business ventures, using joint credit cards to make minimum payments while the principal balances grew exponentially. These connections evolved into an informal network. Women who were experiencing financial concerns in their marriages would reach out, and the network would direct them toward resources and professionals who could help. Sometimes that meant my consulting services. Sometimes it meant other attorneys or forensic accountants or therapists who specialized in helping people navigate the emotional trauma of discovering systematic deception. I had not intended to create this network. I had not planned to become known as someone who specialized in uncovering marital financial fraud. But apparently the combination of my analytical expertise and my willingness to pursue accountability aggressively when evidence warranted it had created something that filled a genuine need. My consulting practice was transforming. I still worked with small businesses that needed financial restructuring, but increasingly my client base included women who needed someone who could look at their household finances with the same ruthless precision I applied to corporate balance sheets. The work was demanding. It required managing the emotional intensity of clients who were dealing with betrayal while maintaining the analytical detachment necessary to build legally defensible cases. But it was also the most meaningful work I had ever done. I was helping people rebuild their lives after discovering that the foundations they had trusted were never as solid as they believed. I understood that experience intimately, and perhaps that understanding made me better at the work than someone who had only studied financial fraud in academic settings without living through its personal devastation. 1 year after Edward threw his car keys at my chest and told me to find my own way home, I walked into a dealership and purchased a vehicle using money I had earned through my own expanded consulting practice. The transaction felt symbolic in ways I had not fully anticipated when I made the decision to replace the aging sedan I had been driving for the past 8 years. I deliberately chose something practical rather than impressive. A reliable SUV in dark blue with good safety ratings and enough space to transport my children and occasionally drive clients to site visits when circumstances required it. The salesman tried to upsell me to a luxury model with features I would never use, but I declined politely and purchased exactly what I needed without apology or explanation. The first time I drove my new vehicle, Olivia sat in the passenger seat scrolling through college brochures. She had been accepted to 3 universities and was trying to decide between programs that would let her study environmental policy and international relations. Her college fund had been fully restored through the settlement with Vanessa, actually growing larger than it would have been if Edward had never depleted it, thanks to investment returns over the period when the funds were being recovered and rebuilt. "Mom, look at this program at Georgetown," she said, turning her phone so I could glance at the screen while keeping my attention on the road. "They have a joint degree in environmental science and policy that seems perfect." "Georgetown is expensive," I said, though I was no longer worried about affording it. "But if that is where you want to go, we will make it work." James sat in the back seat working on a math assignment, occasionally asking me questions about percentages and fractions that I answered while navigating familiar suburban streets. He seemed comfortable and content in ways he had not been during that final year of my marriage when tension had filled our home like something toxic we all pretended not to notice. As I drove, I found myself thinking about Edward's command in that parking lot. "Find your own way home." He had meant it as dismissal, as an assertion of power, as a demonstration that he had found something better and I was no longer necessary to his life. But in the year since that moment I had indeed found my own way home. Not back to the marriage I had been trying to preserve, but forward to something I had built through my own competence and willingness to demand accountability. Home was not the physical house I had been awarded in the divorce, though I was grateful to have kept it for the stability it provided my children. Home was the sense of self-respect I had reclaimed, the financial security I had rebuilt, the knowledge that I would never again accept mistreatment as the price of maintaining appearances. The car keys Edward had thrown at me remained in my office, mounted in a small frame beneath a plaque I had commissioned from a local craftsperson. The plaque read, "Sometimes the worst moments become catalysts for the best decisions." Clients asked about the framed keys during initial consultations. The question usually came after we had discussed their situations and I had begun explaining how financial investigation could document fraud that seemed impossible to prove. They would glance at the frame on the wall behind my desk and ask what it meant. I would tell them the abbreviated version of my story. Not as a tale of victimization, but as a narrative about recognition and appropriate response. I explained that my husband had thrown those keys at me in a parking lot full of witnesses while he left with another woman, And that moment of public humiliation had transformed into the catalyst for comprehensive financial investigation that uncovered fraud I had not known existed. The keys became a teaching tool. A physical representation of the moment when humiliation can transform into determination if you choose to respond strategically rather than emotionally. Many women who came to my office were still in the stage where they blamed themselves. They believed that if they had been more attractive or more attentive or more accommodating, their husbands would not have betrayed them. They carried guilt that was never theirs to carry, shouldering responsibility for choices other people had made. I used the car keys to illustrate that betrayal reflects the betrayer's character flaws rather than the victim's inadequacy. Edward did not throw those keys at me because I was insufficient. He threw them because he lacked integrity and made the catastrophic error of believing I would accept disrespect without consequence. That distinction mattered. Understanding that distinction was often the first step toward my clients being able to pursue accountability rather than accepting blame. Olivia's transformation over that year was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of everything that had happened. She had evolved from a quietly observant teenager into a young woman who understood that self-respect is not negotiable and that appropriate boundaries are essential for healthy relationships. One evening in late summer, about 10 months after the divorce had finalized, Olivia came into my home office where I was reviewing financial statements for a new client. She sat down in the chair across from my desk with the deliberate manner that indicated she wanted to have a serious conversation. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. Do you regret marrying Dad?" I set down the documents I had been reviewing and gave her my complete attention. "I regret staying longer than I should have after recognizing the marriage had failed. But I do not regret the years that gave me you and James. You two are the best things I have ever done with my life, and that would not have been possible without your father." Olivia nodded slowly, processing this answer. "I used to think that being a good wife meant accepting whatever your husband did and making it work no matter what. That marriage required you to just tolerate things because commitment meant never giving up, even when the other person had already given up on you. That is not what healthy partnership looks like," I said gently. "I know that now. Watching you fight back taught me that being a good person means having standards and enforcing them, even when it is hard and people judge you for it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Several of my friends have parents in marriages that are obviously dysfunctional. Their moms tolerate infidelity or financial abuse because they are afraid of being alone or do not think they can support themselves independently. And I watch them pretending everything is fine, and it makes me sad because they are teaching their daughters that accepting mistreatment is normal." "What will you do differently?" I asked. "I will never let anyone treat me the way Dad treated you. And if I ever realize that a relationship is destroying me, I will leave before it takes everything I have built. You taught me that survival after betrayal is not just possible but can actually lead to something better than what existed before." By the end of that first year, my consulting practice had evolved into something I had never intended but that clearly served a genuine need. I now offered comprehensive financial investigation and asset protection services for women navigating divorce, particularly in cases involving fraud, hidden assets, or financial abuse. We had helped clients across Connecticut and expanded into Massachusetts and New York, building a reputation for thoroughness, discretion, and aggressive advocacy when circumstances warranted it. I hired 2 additional financial analysts who specialized in forensic accounting. I brought on a private investigator named Robert Chin who had spent 15 years with the Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit before retiring and starting his own practice. Robert was exceptional at uncovering hidden accounts and tracking asset transfers that people believed were too sophisticated to be discovered. We formalized these services under a new division of my consulting practice. I developed systems and protocols that could be replicated and scaled as demand continued growing. Andrea Thornhill joined as a permanent consultant, splitting her time between providing expert witness testimony in cases that went to court and training my staff on advanced forensic accounting techniques. The work was demanding. It required managing the emotional intensity of clients who were dealing with profound betrayal while maintaining the analytical detachment necessary to build legally defensible cases. But it was also the most meaningful work I had ever done. I could see direct impact in real time. Women who had been financially devastated by dishonest spouses gradually rebuilding security and confidence. Children whose college funds were recovered through our investigations. Families who avoided poverty because we identified and stopped fraudulent transfers before they could be completed. Every morning when I arrived at my office, I saw those car keys in their frame on the wall. And I remembered the lesson I had learned and now taught to others. The moment someone treats you as disposable is the moment you begin documenting everything. Because people who act with that level of contempt inevitably leave trails of evidence that will destroy them if you know where to look. Edward had believed throwing his car keys at me was an assertion of power. A demonstration that he had found someone better and I was no longer necessary to his life. What he had actually done was provide me with physical evidence of his contempt. Evidence I had used to build a case that systematically dismantled not only his life but also exposed an operation that had victimized multiple families. In trying to dispose of me, Edward had inadvertently created something far more powerful than the marriage he destroyed. He had created a professional practice dedicated to helping women refuse to be disposed of. A network of support for people experiencing financial fraud within their marriages. A legacy of accountability that extended far beyond my personal circumstances. That legacy mattered more than any relationship based on performed partnership rather than genuine respect. I had found my own way home. And in doing so, I had built something that would help countless others find theirs. If this story of financial justice and reclaimed dignity had you hooked, hit that like button now. My favorite part was when Catherine discovered the forged mortgage signature and realized Edward had committed actual fraud. What was your favorite moment? Drop your favorite scene in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of people who refuse to accept betrayal quietly. Subscribe and hit that notification bell.